You're basic, you're poor, and you're an embarrassment to a man like Daniel. Alyssa Grant said it loud right there at Elena's own dinner table in the house Elena secretly owned, and then she laughed and slid her hand over Daniel's, and Daniel, Elena's husband of 9 years, just smiled. What none of them knew, what the mistress flaunting her borrowed jewelry couldn't imagine, was that the luxury hotel she bragged about the credit card funding her whole lifestyle. The elite world she thought she was entering, all of it was owned by Elena's billionaire father. Elena set down her fork, folded her hands, and stayed dangerously calm. Before we go on, if you enjoy stories where the quiet ones turn out to hold all the power, take a second to subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because this one pays off in a way you will not want to miss. And do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels tonight. Elena Whitmore had learned a long time ago that silence was not the same as weakness. People confused the two constantly. They looked at a woman who didn't raise her voice, who didn't chase attention, who wore a plain cardigan and drove a 6-year-old sedan, and they decided she must be small. They decided she must be simple. And Elena let them. She had spent 9 years letting Daniel believe that too. That night, after Alyssa left in a swirl of perfume and satisfaction, Daniel stayed at the table nursing a glass of wine that had cost more than he realized. Elena cleared the plates the way she always did, moving quietly, and Daniel watched her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Boredom, maybe, or pity, as if he were already grieving a marriage he'd decided was over. "You didn't say anything," Daniel finally said. Elena rinsed a plate. What was there to say? "She insulted you, in our home, and you just sat there." "Did she?" Elena set the plate in the rack. "I thought she was just telling me who she was." Daniel huffed a short laugh, the kind that had a blade tucked inside it. "See, that's the thing about you, Elena. You never fight for anything. You never fight for us. You just accept. You absorb. It's exhausting." She turned off the water and dried her hands slowly, giving herself the 3 seconds she needed to keep her face still. "Is that what your friend thinks too? Her name is Alyssa. I know her name, Daniel." He stood, and for a moment there was something almost like guilt in him, something that flickered and died. "Look, I didn't want to do this over dishes. But maybe it's better we say it out loud. We've grown apart. You know it. I know it. I'm not the same man I was when I married you, and honestly, I need more than this." He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, at the modest cabinets, at the life they had built. "I need more than this." Elena hung the dish towel on its hook. Her heart was doing something strange in her chest, a slow, heavy thudding, but her voice stayed even. "And Alyssa is more." "Alyssa gets it," Daniel said. "She understands where I'm trying to go. She's got vision. She's got taste. She belongs in the kind of world I'm building." He shook his head. "You'd be lost in it, Elena. You'd embarrass yourself." There it was. Not just "I want out," but "you would embarrass me." Elena had heard men say cruel things before. Her father's boardrooms had taught her that cruelty was often just fear wearing a nicer suit. But this was different. This was her husband, the man she had chosen, the man she had protected, telling her that she was too small for a life he didn't even understand he was standing inside of. "Where are you trying to go, Daniel?" she asked. Not sarcastic, genuinely curious in the way a scientist is curious about a specimen. "Up," he said simply. "The Hallbrook account is about to close. Once that lands, I'm looking at senior partner. There are galas, there are connections, there are people who could change my whole trajectory, and I need a woman on my arm who fits that room." Elena nodded slowly. She thought about the Hallbrook account. She thought about a phone call her father had taken 8 months ago, a favor, a nudge, a name mentioned to the right person over lunch. Daniel had come home that night glowing, telling her he'd landed the biggest client of his career through pure talent. She had smiled and told him she was proud of him. She had let him have it, because that was what you did for the people you loved. You let them believe they had earned their good fortune even when you had quietly carried it to their door. "I'm happy for you," she said, and she meant a version of it, the version that mourned the man he used to be. Daniel blinked. He had clearly braced for tears, for pleading for the messy scene that would let him feel justified. Her calm unsettled him. "That's it. That's all you've got. What do you want me to say?" "I want you to react like a normal person," he snapped. "I want you to be angry. I want you to beg me to stay or throw a plate or something. God, Elena, you don't even fight for your own marriage." And there was the truth of it, wasn't it? He didn't want to be free of her. He wanted to be free of her while feeling like the wronged party. He wanted her to give him the fight that would prove he'd been suffering so he could walk away a hero instead of a coward. Elena declined to give it to him. "I'll get the guest room ready for you," she said, and she walked past him and up the stairs, leaving Daniel standing in the kitchen alone, feeling for the first time in a long time like the ground under his feet was not quite where he thought it was. Upstairs in the small room that had once been meant for a child they'd stopped talking about, Elena sat on the edge of the bed and finally let her shoulders drop. She did not cry. She had cried her real tears months ago in the shower in the car, in the quiet gaps where nobody could see. What she felt now was something colder and clearer, the sensation of a decision settling into place. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father. William Whitmore rarely texted. He preferred to call, or better to appear in person, but he'd been traveling. The message was 3 words. "Are you all right?" Elena stared at it. Her father had a sense for these things. He always had. He'd told her the day she married Daniel, "You're keeping the name off him. You're keeping everything off him. Are you sure?" And she'd said yes. She'd wanted so badly to be loved for the ordinary woman she was inside all that money. She'd wanted one thing in her life that was real, that hadn't been bought or arranged or leveraged. She'd wanted a husband who chose Elena, just Elena. She typed back, "I'm fine, Dad. Daniel and I are ending things. It's mutual." A lie, that last word, but a kind one. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times. Finally, "Come to dinner Sunday. Bring nothing. We'll talk." Elena set the phone down. She thought about the last 9 years. She thought about how carefully she had built the illusion of an ordinary marriage. She had insisted on the modest house, when Daniel could have had a mansion for a wedding gift, if only he'd known who she was. She had paid off the mortgage through a shell trust so quietly that Daniel still believed they were making monthly payments. The money simply flowed out of an account he thought was joint savings and came right back through channels he would never trace. She had watched his credit get approved for things it should never have been approved for, watched interest rates bend in his favor, watched his little disasters get quietly cleaned up before he ever noticed there'd been a fire. And Daniel had walked through all of it believing he was a self-made man. "I need a woman who understands ambition," he'd said. Elena almost smiled. The next morning, Daniel was gone before she woke off to the office to close the deal he thought he'd earned. Elena made herself coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the neighbors' kids wait for the school bus. She had loved this street. She had loved being no one special on it. Mrs. Carter, who brought soup when someone was sick, who remembered birthdays, who never made anyone feel small. That woman had been real. That woman had been her. And Daniel had looked at her and called her mediocre. Her phone rang. Not her father this time, her assistant Priya, a woman who officially did not exist in Daniel's version of Elena's life. Priya managed the parts of Elena's world that stayed in the shadows, the trust, the holdings, the quiet portfolio that had grown under Elena's own decisions into something even her father respected. "Morning," Priya said. "I saw the flag on the Carter accounts. You loosened the mortgage trust. You planning something, or should I just watch?" "Watch for now," Elena said. "Where does the Halbrook account actually sit, the real ownership past the shell?" A pause, keys clicking. Halbrook's parent got absorbed into a holding company 18 months ago. That holding company is a subsidiary of Meridian Group. Another pause. "Elena Meridian is us. That's your father's. That's the diversified arm you sit on the board of." Elena closed her eyes. So the biggest client of Daniel's career, the account he'd staked his entire future on the deal that made him feel important enough to throw away his marriage, sat inside a company her own family controlled. She hadn't arranged that part. It was just the truth of how big the Whitmore reach was. You couldn't move through the upper rooms of that city without brushing against something her family owned. Daniel had been swimming in her world for 9 years and never once felt the water. "Do nothing yet," Elena said. "Just make sure I have full visibility on his exposure, everything the firm has riding on that account, everything he's personally attached his name to." You want the whole picture, Priya said. I want to understand exactly how much of his life is built on a foundation he doesn't know I'm standing on. That's a long list. I have time, Elena said. Send it all. She hung up and refilled her coffee. She was not in that moment planning revenge. Not the way people mean it with rage and screaming and broken glass. Daniel wanted her to react like a normal person. He wanted the plate thrown. Elena had never once in her entire life gotten what she wanted by throwing a plate. She had gotten it by being patient, by being underestimated, by letting people show her exactly who they were before she decided what to do with that information. And Daniel had shown her. Alyssa had shown her. Now it was Elena's turn. 2 days later, she saw Alyssa again, and this time it was not in her own kitchen. It was at a boutique downtown, the expensive kind, with a doorman and a scent piped through the vents, and salespeople trained to size up a customer's bank account in a single glance. Elena had come to pick up an alteration wearing her plain coat, her hair pulled back simply, her face free of the armor. Other women in that store wore like war paint. She wanted one more time to be nobody, to move through the world unseen. It was a comfort she was about to lose forever, and some part of her knew it and wanted to say goodbye to it. Alyssa was there with 2 friends holding court near a rack of dresses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She spotted Elena instantly, and her whole face lit up with the specific cruelty of a person who has been handed a stage. "Oh my God," Alyssa said loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Look who wandered in. Girls, this is Daniel's wife. Well, his soon-to-be ex-wife." She looked Elena up and down, slow and theatrical. "Honey, are you lost? This isn't really your price point, is it?" The salespeople froze. The 2 friends giggled behind their hands. Elena stood very still, holding the little ticket for her alteration. "I'm just picking something up," Elena said quietly. "Picking something up?" Alyssa repeated, delighted. "From here? What a keychain." She turned to her friends. "This is the woman Daniel's been carrying for 9 years. Can you imagine a man like that wasting his best years on this?" She waved a hand at Elena's coat, as if it were something the cat brought in. "No offense, sweetie, but you were always going to lose him. Men like Daniel are built for a certain kind of life, and you're just not it. You're the starter wife, the practice round." One of the friends said, "Alyssa, stop." But she was laughing when she said it, so it didn't count as stopping. Elena felt the old heat rise up the back of her neck, the human part of her that wanted badly to open her mouth and end this woman's entire performance with 3 sentences and a name. She could do it. She could say the hotel you posted from last weekend, the one you tagged with all those hashtags about living your best life. "My father owns it, and the credit card that paid for your suite runs through a trust with my name on it. And this store, this exact store, leases its space from a property group I sit on the board of, so please tell me again about my price point." But Elena had not gotten to where she was by spending her best cards in a boutique on a Tuesday. "You're right," Elena said instead, and her voice was gentle. "I'm probably not the kind of woman Daniel's looking for anymore." Alyssa blinked, thrown by the agreement. She'd wanted a fight. "So I'll let you have him," Elena continued. "I hope he's everything you think he is." She took her alteration from the stunned sales clerk, thanked her by name, and walked out, leaving Alyssa standing in the middle of the store with her friends feeling, without quite understanding why, like she had just lost something instead of won it. In the car, Elena sat for a full minute with both hands on the wheel, breathing. Her hands were shaking not from fear, but from the effort of restraint. She thought about her father's voice, an old lesson from when she was 17, and someone had humiliated her at a school function. He'd said, "Never let them see the moment they lost. Let them find out later when it's too late to take it back. The public collapse is a gift you give yourself only once. Save it for someone who's truly earned it." Alyssa had earned it. Daniel had earned it. But not yet. Not here. The charity gala was in 3 weeks. Elena's father, William Whitmore, hosted it every year. It was the crown jewel of the city's philanthropic season, a night when the truly powerful gathered under one roof, when reputations were made and unmade over a single conversation, when the difference between the people who mattered and the people who merely wanted to matter became painfully, permanently clear. For 9 years, Elena had skipped it, or attended only quietly, arriving early and leaving before the speeches, keeping her face out of the photographs, protecting the small, ordinary life she'd built with a man who thought she was beneath him. This year, she would not be skipping it. That evening, Daniel came home in a foul mood. The Halbrook deal, he told her, had hit a snag. Some review from higher up, some due diligence hold nobody had warned him about. He paced the kitchen, running his hands through his hair. "It's political," he muttered. "Somebody upstairs is sitting on it. After everything I put into this, somebody I've never even met is deciding whether I get to close." He looked at Elena almost accusingly, as if she should have answers. "You wouldn't understand. It's a whole different world at that level." Elena, who sat on the board of the company that owned the account, who had personally asked Priya that morning to place exactly one small, careful hold on the review, pending her review, nodded sympathetically. "I'm sure it'll work out." "It has to," Daniel said. "It's everything. It's the gala. It's the partners. It's Alyssa. It's the whole life." He caught himself, glanced at her. "Sorry, that was—" "It's fine," Elena said. "You should be honest with me. We're past pretending, aren't we?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and something crossed his face that might have been the ghost of the man she'd married. "You're being weirdly decent about all this. Would you prefer I wasn't—" "No," he admitted. "It's just not what I expected. I expected—" He stopped. "You expected me to fall apart," Elena said. "You expected proof that you'd broken me, so you could feel better about the fact that you're leaving." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "Maybe not," Elena said, "but it's true." She rose from the table. "You should get some rest, Daniel. You've got a big deal to save." She left him there, and once again he was struck by the strange sensation of a floor that was not where he'd put his foot. Over the next 3 weeks, Elena moved carefully. She did not slam doors. She did not hire a lawyer to bleed him dry, though she could have hired the best in the country with a single call. She did something quieter and far more devastating. She simply began one thread at a time to withdraw the invisible support that had held Daniel's life together for 9 years. The mortgage trust, which had quietly absorbed their housing costs, she left in place for now. She was not a monster, and there were legal ways to handle the house later. But the credit line Daniel used so freely, the one with the impossibly generous limit and the interest rate that never made sense, ran through an account tied to her family's financial arm. Elena instructed Priya to let it revert to its true market terms, not to cancel it, not yet, just to stop bending reality in Daniel's favor. Let him feel for the first time in 9 years the actual weight of his own choices. The Halbrook review she kept on hold, not killed, held, suspended over Daniel's future like a held breath, and the gala she prepared for. Her father came by on a Sunday, ostensibly to have coffee, actually, to look at his daughter with the careful attention of a man who had built an empire and knew when something was about to shift. They sat on the back porch of the modest house, and William Whitmore, a silver-haired man whose quietness could empty a room faster than any shout, sipped his coffee and waited. "You've decided something," he said. "I have," Elena said. "Tell me." So she told him about Alyssa in the kitchen, about Daniel calling her mediocre financially beneath him in embarrassment, about the boutique, about 9 years of carrying a man who never once suspected he was being carried. William listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set his cup down. "I told you when you married him to keep everything off him. You wanted him to love the ordinary version of you. I understood that. I respected it." He paused. "But I always wondered what would happen the day he found out he'd been living inside your world without knowing it." "Now we'll both find out," Elena said. "And what is it you want exactly?" her father asked. "Because I can end him by Tuesday. His firm, his reputation, his little deal. Say the word and it's done, and he never even knows my name." Elena shook her head slowly. "No, I don't want it done in the dark. He spent 9 years thinking he built everything himself. He looked me in the eye and told me I would embarrass him in his world." She looked at her father. "I want him to understand in front of everyone whose world it always was." Something moved behind William Whitmore's eyes, something that was almost pride. "The gala." "The gala," Elena said. "Daniel's chasing an invitation for himself and Alyssa. He thinks it's his ticket into the real rooms. Let him have it, Dad. Let them both come. Seat them wherever a man like that gets seated when nobody's protecting him." Her father smiled slow and cold. "Far from the center." "Very far," Elena agreed. "And you?" Elena looked out at the small backyard where she'd spent 9 years being no one special in a life she had chosen with her whole heart, and that had been thrown back in her face like something worthless. "I'll come as myself," she said quietly. "As Elena Whitmore. For the first time in 9 years, I'll walk into that room and let them all see exactly who I am." William reached over and put his weathered hand over his daughter's. "You know, once you do this, there's no going back to being invisible. They'll all know, every one of them. You'll be a Whitmore again in the light for good." Elena was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the woman she'd been on this street. Mrs. Carter with the soup and the remembered birthdays. She mourned her a little. But that woman had died the night Daniel called her mediocre, and Alyssa laughed, and the man she'd chosen said nothing. "I know," Elena said. "I'm ready." That night alone in the house while Daniel worked late at the office, or wherever he actually was, Elena took out a dress she had never worn. It had hung in the back of her closet for 3 years, a gift from her father, a piece of couture so exquisite it seemed to hold its own light. She had never had an occasion grand enough or a reason bold enough to wear it. She held it up against herself in the mirror and looked at the woman she was about to become again after so long in the shadows. Her phone buzzed. Daniel. "Landed an invite to the Whitmore Gala. This is it, Elena. This is the room I've been trying to get into for years. Don't wait up." Elena read it twice. Then she typed back, calm as still water. "Congratulations, Daniel. I hope it's everything you dreamed." She set the phone down and looked back at the mirror at the dress at herself. In 3 weeks, Daniel Carter would walk into the most important room of his life, chasing a world he thought was finally opening its doors to him. He would bring the woman he'd chosen over his wife, the woman who'd mocked Elena as basic, poor, unworthy. They would arrive believing they had won. They would look for their seats and find themselves placed at the very edge of the room, far from the power, far from the light, and they would not understand why. And then the host would introduce his daughter, the true heir of the Whitmore Empire, the woman who had funded a man's entire life without his knowledge, who had carried him through 9 years of good fortune. He mistook for his own talent, who had paid the mortgage he thought he was paying, propped up the career he thought he'd built, and stood unseen at the foundation of everything he had. Elena Whitmore, not a guest, the heir. She turned off the light and stood in the dark a moment longer, feeling the old lessons settle into her bones. Never let them see the moment they lost. Let them find out later when it's too late to take it back. Daniel and Alyssa were about to find out, and Elena Whitmore had never in her entire life felt more ready to be exactly who she was. The morning after Daniel got his invitation, he came downstairs whistling, and Elena had to look away from him to hide what was on her face. He hadn't whistled in over a year. Not for her, not for anything they'd shared. But one email with the Whitmore name at the top of it, and the man had turned back into someone who could be happy. "Big day today," he said, straightening his tie in the reflection of the microwave. "The Halbrook hold might finally lift. I've got a good feeling. And the gala's in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Elena. Do you understand what that room does for a man's career?" "I have an idea," she said. "No, you don't. You couldn't." He said it without cruelty this time, almost gently, the way you'd explain something to a child. "The people in that room don't hire you. They anoint you. One handshake with the right person, and everything changes." He grabbed his keys. "Alyssa's already picked out her dress. She spent a fortune. Says you only get one first impression with people like that." Elena set down her coffee. "You told her you're bringing her." "Of course I'm bringing her. She belongs in that room." He caught himself, but only barely. "Look, I know it's awkward, but we're being adults about this, right? You said yourself we're past pretending." "We are," Elena agreed. "Have a good day, Daniel." He left, and the whistling faded down the driveway, and Elena stood in the kitchen thinking about how easy it had been. He'd walked right through the door she'd left open. He was going to bring Alyssa to her father's gala in a dress that cost a fortune to make a first impression on people he thought would anoint him. Her phone rang before the car had even reached the corner. Priya. "He's going to call the firm in about 20 minutes to check on the Halbrook hold," Priya said. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing," Elena said. "Keep the hold exactly where it is. Let him twist a little longer. When's the last possible day it can lift before the gala? The review's scheduled to clear the day before if you release it." Elena thought about that. The day before the gala. Daniel would walk into that room believing he'd finally closed the biggest deal of his life, riding high, invincible. He'd be at the very peak of his confidence when the floor came out from under him. There was a cruelty in the timing, and Elena didn't flinch from it. He'd earned the timing. "Release it the day before," she said. "Let him have his win. Let him walk in believing he's untouchable." "You're colder than your father," Priya said, and there was admiration in it. "No," Elena said. "My father would have ended it in the dark. I want Daniel to see it. There's a difference." She hung up and went about her day, and this was the part that unsettled even her, how ordinary it all felt. She bought groceries. She called the plumber about the leak under the guest bathroom sink, the guest bathroom that Daniel was now sleeping near in the room that had once been meant for a child. She lived the small life for 2 more weeks, the last 2 weeks of it, and she let herself feel every hour of it because she knew she'd never get it back. 8 days before this gala, Alyssa showed up at the house. Elena opened the door, and there she was in oversized sunglasses and a coat that probably cost more than the car in the driveway, holding a paper bag from a bakery like a peace offering that was actually a weapon. "Can I come in?" Alyssa said, already stepping past her. "We should talk, woman to woman." Elena closed the door slowly. "What do you want, Alyssa?" "I want to make sure there's no drama." Alyssa set the bakery bag on the counter and looked around the kitchen with barely concealed distaste. God, this place. Daniel really lived like this. No wonder he's ready to move up. She turned. "Here's the thing, sweetie. The gala's next weekend. Daniel's bringing me. It's a big night for him, and I don't want you making it weird, showing up causing a scene, whatever sad little thing you might be planning." Elena leaned against the counter. "What makes you think I'd be there?" Alyssa laughed. "Oh, honey, you wouldn't get within a mile of that gala. That's exactly my point. That's not your world. It was never going to be your world. Daniel needs a woman who can walk into a room full of the most powerful people in this city and hold her own." She gestured at herself. "That's me, and I need you to be gracious about it." "Gracious," Elena repeated. "Don't fight the divorce. Don't drag it out. Let Daniel move on. He deserves to be happy, and honestly, so do you. Find some nice, simple guy who fits your lifestyle." Alyssa smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who believed she'd already won every game that would ever be played. "You'll thank me one day." Elena was quiet for a long moment. She could have ended it right there in her own kitchen one more time. The words were right there. Instead, she said, "You really love him." Alyssa blinked. "What?" "Daniel, you love him. Or you love what you think he's about to become." "He's going places," Alyssa said, but something flickered. "He is," Elena agreed softly, "one way or another." She picked up the bakery bag and held it out. "Take your croissants, Alyssa, and enjoy the gala. Truly. I hope it's a night you never forget." Alyssa took the bag thrown off balance, the same way Daniel kept getting thrown off balance, unable to find the fight she'd braced for. She left heels clicking down the walk, and Elena watched her go and felt almost sorry for her. Almost. That night, Daniel came home glowing again. "The hold's still on," he said, dropping into a kitchen chair. "But my contact says it's about to clear. Any day now. And get this, the partners are noticing me. Word's out I got the gala invite. Suddenly, everybody wants to grab lunch." He laughed, delighted with himself. "Funny how that works. A month ago, half of them wouldn't return my calls." "Funny," Elena echoed. "You should have seen Reyes today. The man's ignored me for 2 years. Today he's asking if I want to join his fantasy football league." Daniel shook his head, marveling. "This is what I've been telling you. It's all about the room you're in. Get in the right room and the whole world changes its mind about you overnight." Elena set a plate in front of him the way she had for 9 years. "And what happens if you get thrown out of the room?" Daniel laughed, not even looking up. "Why would I get thrown out? I'm just getting in." He started eating. "You worry about the strangest things, Elena. You always have. That's your problem. You've got no vision. You can't see past the end of the block." Elena looked at the top of his head, at the man she'd married, at the man who couldn't see past the end of his own certainty. "You're probably right," she said, and she went upstairs. 6 days before the gala, her father called with news that changed the shape of the whole thing. "There's a complication," William said. "Daniel's firm, the one he works for. I did some digging on the ownership the way you asked, all the way up the chain." A pause. "Elena, the firm's parent, got acquired last quarter by a company inside Meridian, your Meridian. The firm Daniel works for is already ours. It has been for 3 months and nobody at his level knows it yet." Elena sat down slowly. "He works for us." "He works for you," her father corrected. "Technically, through about 4 layers of holding company, Daniel Carter's paycheck is signed by an entity you sit on the board of. His promotion to senior partner, the one he's chasing, the one he's throwing away his marriage for, that decision routes up to a compensation committee. And guess who quietly controls the seat that committee reports to?" Elena closed her eyes. There was something almost unbearable about it, the completeness of it, the way Daniel had spent 9 years inside her world without ever once touching the walls of it. His house hers, his credit hers, his biggest client hers, and now his very job, the identity he'd built his whole sense of superiority on, hers too. He'd told her she was financially beneath him, while every dollar he earned flowed eventually back to a family he didn't know existed. "So the promotion," Elena said, "is yours to grant or deny," her father said. "You could make him senior partner tomorrow, or you could make sure he never works in this city again. It's entirely up to you." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and then unexpectedly, she felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from something harder to name. 9 years. She'd wanted so badly one thing that was real. One man who'd chosen her, not the money, not the name, not the empire. She'd hidden all of it, buried it so deep, given up so much of who she was, all so she could believe that Daniel loved Elena the woman and not Whitmore the fortune. And it turned out he had been living off the fortune the entire time. He just hadn't known it. He'd taken all the benefits of her world and none of the truth of it, and then he'd called her mediocre and left her for a woman who mocked her clothes. "Elena," her father said gently, "are you all right?" "I gave up everything to find out if he loved me for me," Elena said, and her voice cracked once before she caught it. "And the answer is, he didn't even love me for me. He loved the life I built for him and thought he built himself." "I know," William said. "I'm sorry. I've been sorry for 9 years, watching you shrink yourself for a man who never deserved it." Elena wiped her eyes and let out a slow breath, and when she spoke again, the crack was gone. "Then let's give him what he actually earned. Grant the promotion, Dad. Make him senior partner, the day before the gala. Let him have the title. Let him walk into that room believing he's arrived. Because a man can't fall from the floor, he has to fall from the top." Her father was silent for a moment. Then, "You are absolutely my daughter." "Grant it," Elena said. "And on my signal at the gala, we take it all back at once. The promotion, the client, the credit, all of it. In front of the whole room, let him understand in real time exactly whose world he's been standing in." "It'll destroy him." "He destroyed himself," Elena said. "I'm just removing the support I never should have given him in the first place." 4 days before the gala, Daniel got the promotion. He came home and he didn't whistle. He practically levitated. He burst through the door with a bottle of champagne, the good kind, and he was so happy that for a moment, one strange, painful moment, Elena saw the boy she'd fallen in love with a decade ago, before the ambition ate him hollow. "Senior partner," he shouted. "Elena, senior partner. Youngest in the history of the firm. They fast-tracked it. They said my numbers were undeniable. They said I was exactly the kind of leader they wanted, representing the firm at the highest level." He was pouring champagne into 2 glasses, one for her out of pure overflow. "Do you understand what this means? The Halbrook hold cleared this morning, too. Everything's breaking my way. Everything." Elena took the glass he pushed into her hand. "Congratulations, Daniel. You must feel like the world finally sees you." "That's exactly it. That's exactly how it feels." He drank. "For years I felt invisible, overlooked, passed over for men with connections I didn't have, and now all of a sudden the doors are flying open. Halbrook, the promotion, the gala. It's like something up there finally decided it was my turn." Something up there, Elena thought. Yes, Something up there did. I'm bringing Alyssa to the gala as senior partner. Daniel went on riding the wave. She's going to lose her mind. She's already talking about which of the partners' wives she wants to network with. He shook his head. She's got instincts, that woman. She sees the whole board. Not like... He stopped. Not like me, Elena finished for him. Daniel had the grace to look for half a second uncomfortable. I didn't mean it like that. Yes, you did. Elena set her glass down untouched. It's all right, Daniel. You've been very clear about what you think of me. Basic, mediocre, financially beneath you, no vision, can't see past the end of the block. She listed them calmly one by one and watched each one land. I've heard all of it. I'm not asking you to take any of it back. Daniel set his own glass down. The champagne had gone flat in his mouth. Why are you being like this tonight of all nights? Can't you just be happy for me? I am happy for you, Elena said. I want you to walk into that gala on Saturday feeling exactly the way you feel right now, on top of the world, untouchable. I want you to have that feeling, Daniel. I want you to have all of it. She held his eyes. You've earned it. And Daniel, who had spent 9 years unable to read the woman standing in front of him, mistook the ice in her voice for surrender. He softened. You know you're being really classy about this. I'll say that for you. A lot of women would have torched everything by now. You're just letting me go. He picked his glass back up. It's decent of you. I'll make sure the divorce is fair. You'll be taken care of. I'm not a monster. No, Elena said quietly. Neither am I. Remember that on Saturday. He didn't hear it. He was already lost in the future, already at the gala in his mind, already shaking the hands that would anoint him. He never heard the warning she gave him plainly to his face in his own kitchen. 2 days before the gala, Elena went to see her mother. Her mother had been gone for 6 years, but Elena went to the cemetery anyway, the way she did when a decision sat heavy in her. She stood at the grave and talked the way you talk to someone who can't answer but somehow still helps. I did what you always said, Mom, she murmured. I found a man who didn't know who I was, and I let him love the real me. And it turns out there was no real me to him. There was just the life I gave him. She was quiet for a moment. You tell me to walk away clean, not to make a scene. You always hated a scene. She almost smiled. But this one's earned, Mom. This one I'm going to make. On her way out of the cemetery, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She almost didn't open it. When she did, her breath caught. It was Alyssa. Somehow she'd gotten the number. The message read, Heard you're planning to show up Saturday. Don't. This is Daniel's night and mine. You'll only humiliate yourself. Last warning, sweetie. Elena stared at it. So Daniel had told Alyssa she might come, and Alyssa was frightened enough to threaten her. Good. Let her be frightened. Elena typed back a single line. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Whatever Alyssa was typing, she thought better of it, because no reply ever came. The night before the gala, Daniel didn't come home at all. Elena knew where he was. She didn't need to wonder. He was with Alyssa, celebrating, rehearsing their triumph, planning their grand entrance into a world they thought was theirs. She sat in the quiet house, the modest house she'd chosen and loved, and would soon leave forever, and she let herself feel the full weight of the ending. Her father called at 10. You sure about this? I'm sure. There's no undoing it once it's done, not the public part. Money can be repaired, reputations can't. When we take it all back in that room in front of those people, Daniel Carter is finished in this city. Not poor. Finished. Nobody will touch him. I know. And you're at peace with that. Elena looked around the kitchen, at the plates she'd washed 10,000 times, at the little life she'd built and been told was worthless. He looked me in the eye, she said, and told me I would embarrass him in his world. His world, Dad. He doesn't have a world. He's been a guest in mine for 9 years and never once said thank you because he never once knew to. Her voice was steady. I'm at peace. Then it's done, William said. The seating's arranged. The Carter party's at table 41, as far from center as the room goes right by the service door, and when you give the signal, everything reverts at once. The promotion, the client, the credit line, the mortgage trust, all of it live in the room. How does it revert? The compensation committee's issuing a same-night correction, an acquisition review clawback. It'll come to Daniel's phone as an official notice from his own firm at the exact moment I introduce you from the stage. He'll be reading his own downfall on his screen while the whole room watches you rise. Her father paused. It's theatrical. It's cruel. It's exactly what you asked for. Elena closed her eyes. It's exactly what he did to me. He humiliated me in my own kitchen in a boutique in front of his mistress. He just did it where nobody important was watching. On Saturday, everybody important will be watching. Get some sleep, sweetheart, her father said. Tomorrow you come home. Elena hung up, but she didn't sleep. She sat with the couture dress laid out across the guest bed, the dress she'd been saving for 3 years, and she thought about the woman she'd been and the woman she was about to become again. Around 2 a.m, she heard Daniel's key in the lock. He came in quietly, thinking she was asleep, and she listened to him move through the house, humming under his breath, a man on the eve of everything he'd ever wanted. He paused outside the guest room. For a moment she thought he might come in. He didn't. He just stood there in the hallway, and then he said softly, almost to himself, "Tomorrow everything changes." "Yes," Elena whispered, too quiet for him to hear. "It does." The morning of the gala, the house was strange with tension. Daniel got up early and spent an hour on his appearance, more time than she'd ever seen him spend, and when he finally came down, he looked, she had to admit, like exactly the man he'd always wanted to be. Polished, sharp, confident, a man walking toward his coronation. "Alyssa's meeting me there," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "She wanted to make a separate entrance. Says it's more dramatic." He checked himself in the hallway mirror. "You really not coming?" Elena, still in her ordinary clothes, still playing the small, quiet wife one last time, shook her head. "I told you I'd be there." Daniel laughed. "Come on, Elena. Be serious. How would you even get in? It's the most exclusive event of the year. You don't have an invitation. You don't know anyone. You'd be turned away at the door." He said it kindly, which was almost worse. "Stay home. Watch something. Have a nice night. I mean that." "That's generous of you," Elena said. "I'm feeling generous. It's a generous kind of day." He grabbed his coat. "I'll be home late. Or, maybe I'll stay at Alyssa's. We should probably start figuring out the living situation soon anyway." He said this last part like an afterthought, like he was mentioning the weather, and it was the casual cruelty of it that finally fully killed the last soft thing Elena had been carrying for him. "We should," she agreed. "After tonight, I think everything will sort itself out." "That's the spirit." He opened the door, then paused, and for one last time looked at her with something that might have been the ghost of affection. "You were a good wife, Elena. You were. Just not the wife I needed to get where I'm going. No hard feelings, okay?" Elena looked at him. This man she'd carried for 9 years, standing in the doorway of a house he thought was his, about to walk into a room he thought would make him. "No hard feelings, Daniel," she said. "Go get everything you deserve." He smiled, missing entirely the second meaning, and left. Elena waited until his car was gone. Then she called Priya. "Bring the car and the team at 6. And Priya, yeah, bring my name, all of it. Tonight, I'm a Whitmore again." She hung up and went upstairs, and she began slowly to take off the small life she'd worn for 9 years. At the same time, across the city, Alyssa was in a hotel suite doing her makeup, a suite she'd bragged about on social media all week, tagged with a dozen hashtags about living her best life, a suite in a hotel that, though she didn't know, it was owned outright by the Whitmore family. She was on the phone with a friend, laughing. "I'm telling you, tonight is the night everything changes," Alyssa said, applying lipstick that had been charged to a card funded by a trust with Elena's name on it. "Daniel just made senior partner at his age. We are about to be the couple in this city, and the best part, his sad little wife is sitting at home in her cardigan, probably crying into a bowl of cereal." She laughed. "God, I almost feel bad for her. Almost. But some women are just born to lose, you know. You can't help someone who was never going to make it. Her friend said something, and Alyssa laughed again. No, she won't show. She's got no invitation, no connections, no clue. She's a nobody. She's always been a nobody. Trust me, by this time next year, Daniel won't even remember her name. Alyssa checked herself in the mirror, glowing with certainty. Tonight belongs to the winners. And honey, I have never lost a night in my life. She had no idea that every dollar of the suite, the dress, the makeup, the car service she'd ordered for the evening ran through the very family she was mocking. She had no idea that the invitation Daniel was so proud of had been allowed deliberately by the woman she called a nobody. She had no idea that the seats waiting for them at table 41 had been chosen personally by a woman who never once needed to raise her voice. She finished her lipstick, blew a kiss at her own reflection, and went to become in her mind the queen of a kingdom that had never for 1 second belonged to her. Back at the house, Elena stood in front of the mirror in the couture dress, and she barely recognized herself. The plain suburban wife was gone. In her place stood a woman who moved through the highest rooms in the country as easily as breathing. A woman whose signature moved millions, whose name opened any door, whose quiet had emptied boardrooms full of men far more dangerous than Daniel Carter. Priya arrived at 6, exactly took one look at her and stopped in the doorway. "There she is," Priya said softly. "I almost forgot what she looked like." "So did I," Elena said. "Your father's already there. The room's full. The Carter party checked in 20 minutes ago. Table 41 right by the service door exactly as ordered." Priya held out a slim folder. "Everything's staged. The clawback notice the client transfer the credit reversion. It all fires the second your father says your name from the stage. You just have to walk in." Elena took the folder but didn't open it. She didn't need to. Daniel's happy. Glowing from what I hear. Working the room. Introducing himself as senior partner to anyone who'll shake his hand. Alyssa's showing off her jewelry to the partners' wives. Priya paused. They think they've made it. Let them think it a little longer. Elena set the folder down. 10 more minutes of it. Let them have 10 more minutes on top of the world. She looked around the house one final time, the small, ordinary house where she'd been Mrs. Carter, where she'd made soup and remembered birthdays, and been for a while exactly the woman she'd wanted to be. She said goodbye to it silently. And then she walked out the door, and she did not look back. In the car gliding toward the gala, Elena's phone buzzed. A text from Daniel sent to her out of pure, overflowing joy, not even thinking about what he was doing. "Wish you could see this place, Elena. The people here, the power in this room. This is what I've been chasing my whole life. This is where I belong. I know things ended weird between us, but I hope someday you find your version of this. Everybody deserves to feel like they finally made it." Elena read it twice. Then she looked out at the lights of the city, sliding past the city. Her family had helped build the city, where every powerful room eventually traced back to a name she'd hidden for 9 years. "I hope so too, Daniel," she said quietly to the empty car. "I really do." And then she typed one last message to him, the last message she would ever send him as his wife. And she chose the words with care because she wanted him to remember them later when he understood. "I'm on my way. Save me a seat at the center of the room." She hit send. Watched the 3 dots appear as Daniel, somewhere in that glittering room, read it and laughed and typed back something she didn't bother to read. The car pulled up to the entrance. Doormen she'd known since childhood straightened at the sight of the plates. Somewhere inside, her father was waiting near the stage. Somewhere at table 41 by the service door, Daniel Carter sat glowing, and Alyssa Grant flashed jewelry funded by a family she'd spent weeks mocking, and neither of them had the faintest idea that the woman about to walk through those doors held every single thread of the lives they thought were finally theirs. Elena Whitmore stepped out of the car, and she walked in. The moment Elena stepped through the doors, the room changed. Not all at once, not loudly, but like a current shifting under still water. The people nearest the entrance, the ones who mattered most, who knew every face worth knowing, turned toward her the way flowers turn toward light. A hush moved outward from her in rings. Conversations died mid-sentence. A senator's wife touched her husband's arm. An old shipping magnate set down his glass. And somewhere in that first ripple, A name began to travel across the room in urgent whispers. Whitmore! That's a Whitmore! That's the Whitmore! Elena didn't slow her step. She'd learned as a girl how to walk into a room like this, chin-level eyes forward-moving as though the room had always belonged to her because it had. 9 years of shrinking herself fell away with every stride. She could feel it happening, the old self clicking back into place, the woman who had been buried under cardigans and casseroles rising up through her spine. A man in a perfect suit materialized beside her, the event director pale with the specific terror of a professional who has just realized a member of the host family entered unannounced. Miss Whitmore, your father didn't tell us I would have. Please may I show you to the family table? In a moment, Elena said pleasantly. I'd like to see the room first. She let her eyes travel across it slow and unhurried, and about 200 of the most powerful people in the city looked back at her, and every one of them was recalculating. That was the thing about a room like this. Everyone in it had spent their lives learning to read where the real power sat, and every one of them had just watched the temperature of the room reorganize itself around a woman most of them had never seen before. They didn't know her, but they knew what that ripple meant. It meant she was someone. It meant whatever happened next, they wanted to be on the right side of it. At table 41 near the service door, Daniel Carter had his back to the entrance. He was mid-story, gesturing with his champagne, telling the couple beside him about the Hallbrook deal, about being the youngest senior partner in the firm's history, when he noticed that they'd stopped listening. Their eyes had drifted past his shoulder toward the front of the room, gone wide, and neither of them was hearing a word he said. Sorry, the man said, distracted. Something's happening up front. Daniel turned in his seat, annoyed at losing his audience, and looked toward the entrance to see what everyone was suddenly so interested in, and he saw his wife. Except it wasn't his wife, it couldn't be. The woman near the doors wore a gown that caught the light like liquid, stood surrounded by the most important people in the room, as though she were the most important thing in it, and carried herself with a bearing Daniel had never once in 9 years seen on Elena. His brain refused it. It simply refused. It offered him easier explanations. A look-alike, a trick of the light, somebody who resembled her. But then she turned her head, and their eyes met across the entire length of the room, and Daniel Carter felt something drop through the floor of his stomach. Elena, he said out loud to no one, and the champagne glass tilted in his hand. Across the room, coming from the opposite direction, Alyssa was returning from working, the crowd glowing, having just introduced herself to 2 partners' wives as the future Mrs. Carter. She saw Daniel's face, first saw the color drain from it, and followed his gaze to the front of the room. She saw a woman being fussed over by the event staff, surrounded by important-looking people, and her first thought, her competitive instinct, was pure jealousy. Who is that? Why is everyone looking at her? That should be me. And then the woman turned fully, and Alyssa saw her face. No, Alyssa said. She actually laughed a short, disbelieving bark. No, that can't be. She grabbed the back of Daniel's chair. Daniel, why does that woman look like that's not your wife? Your wife is at home, in her cardigan. Daniel couldn't speak. He was staring at Elena the way a man stares at a word he's read 10,000 times that has suddenly stopped making sense. Daniel, Alyssa's voice climbed. Say something. Why is everyone bowing to a woman who looks exactly like you? This is a joke, right? This is some kind of... Is she crashing? Did she crash to embarrass us? Oh my God, she crashed the gala. Alyssa's fear curdled instantly into fury. That desperate little I told her not to come. I warned her. She's going to make a scene and ruin everything. Somebody needs to have her removed right now before she embarrasses you in front of all these... Alyssa. Daniel's voice was hoarse. Stop talking. Excuse me? Look at where she's standing. Daniel's hand had gone cold around the glass. Look at who's standing next to her. That's Harrington. That's Judge Vell. That's Alyssa. Those are the people I've been trying to get a meeting with for 2 years, and they're standing around her like she's what? Alyssa demanded. Daniel didn't answer, because the answer forming in his mind was too large, too impossible, and it threatened to unmake everything he thought he knew about the last 9 years of his life. At the front of the room, the event director had finally worked up the courage to speak again. Miss Whitmore, your father is by the stage. He's asked me to bring you the moment you arrived. He'd like to, that as the introductions are about to begin, and he wanted you beside him. Then let's not keep him waiting, Elena said. She began to move through the room, and here was the moment she had waited 9 years for, though she hadn't known she was waiting for it until Daniel called her mediocre in her own kitchen. Her path to the stage carried her by design right past table 41. Her father had arranged it. She had asked him to, and as she walked, the whole room watched her walk, and the whispers followed her like a train. Daniel stood up as she approached. He didn't decide to. His body just did it the way you stand when something enormous enters a room. "Elena," he said. His voice cracked on the second syllable. "Elena, what is happening? Why are they calling you?" Elena stopped. She looked at him. This man she'd carried for 9 years, standing at the worst table in the room in his brand new senior partner confidence, and she felt for one clean moment absolutely nothing at all. Not anger, not love, not even satisfaction yet. Just a vast, quiet stillness. "Hello, Daniel," she said. "You told me I'd never get in the door." Alyssa shoved forward past Daniel, her face blotchy with panic and rage. "You need to leave, right now. I don't know how you talked your way in here, but this is Daniel's night and you are not going to ruin it with some pathetic stunt. Do you understand me? These are important people. This is a real world and you don't belong in it. So take your rented dress and your little revenge fantasy and get out before you humiliate yourself." Elena turned to look at Alyssa and she almost smiled. "Rented," she repeated softly. "You heard me." "Alyssa," Daniel said, his voice strangled. "Stop, please stop talking." "No. Why are you defending her? She showed up to sabotage you, and you're just standing there like—" Alyssa's eyes darted around, and she saw the way the room was watching, and something in her began finally to understand that the ground had shifted, that the audience she'd wanted was here, but they weren't watching her the way she'd imagined. They were watching Elena. All of them watching Elena the way you watch royalty. "Who are you?" Alyssa said, and for the first time her voice had fear in it instead of contempt. "Who are you really?" But Elena had already turned away from her, because at that moment a voice came over the room, warm and commanding, a voice that quieted 200 powerful people, in an instant the voice of the man whose name was on the entire evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," said William Whitmore from the stage, "if I could have your attention." The room fell silent. Daniel turned toward the stage, still clutching his champagne, and beside him Alyssa went very still, and at tables all across the ballroom the most powerful people in the city gave the old man their complete attention. "Thank you all for being here tonight," William began, "for your generosity, for your friendship, for your commitment to the causes that brought us together. This gala has been my family's honor to host for 30 years. He paused, and his eyes found Elena in the crowd, and something in his face softened, in a way that only a handful of people in that room had ever seen. 30 years. In that time, I've watched this city change. I've watched it grow, and I've watched my own family grow alongside it. Maima. Daniel's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He ignored it. His whole attention was locked on the stage, on the terrible arithmetic beginning to complete itself in his mind. "Many of you know my story," William continued. "Fewer of you know the whole of it, because for a long time I've kept something close to my chest, or rather, someone." His eyes returned to Elena, and now the whole room followed his gaze, 200 heads turning as one, toward the woman standing near table 41, the woman standing right beside the newly minted senior partner and his glittering companion. "The greatest thing I ever built was not a company. It was not a fortune. It was a daughter." Daniel's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. He didn't hear it break. "For 9 years, William said, my daughter chose to live a life outside the spotlight. She wanted more than anything to be loved for who she was and not for the name she carried. She kept that name hidden. She lived quietly. She asked for nothing." His voice hardened just slightly, just enough that the people who knew him best sat up straighter. "And I respected her wish even when it cost me the joy of seeing her celebrated as she deserved. But tonight that changes. Tonight, I want every person in this room to know exactly who she is." Daniel's phone buzzed again, and again, and again, a rapid cascade of notifications he couldn't feel through the roaring in his ears. "It is my profound honor," William Whitmore said, and he extended his hand toward the crowd, toward the woman standing at the worst table in the room, to introduce formally and finally the heir to the Whitmore empire, the future of everything my family has built, my daughter, Elena Whitmore. The room erupted, not in shock exactly because the powerful do not gasp, but in a rolling wave of recognition and reassessment, and above all, applause. 200 of the most important people in the city rose to their feet and turned toward Elena and applauded, and the sound of it filled the enormous room and rolled over table 41 like a tide. Daniel stood frozen in the middle of it. His mind had finally finished the equation, and the answer was unbearable. Elena, his wife, the woman he'd called mediocre, financially beneath him, the woman he'd told would embarrass him in his world. She was a Whitmore. She was the Whitmore, the heir, the daughter, the name on the building, the name on the gala, the name that made the most powerful people in the city rise to their feet. "No," Daniel whispered. No, that's not. She cooks, she cleans, she drives a Honda. She's not." Beside him, Alyssa had gone the color of ash. Her mouth opened and closed. The two partners' wives she'd introduced herself to 20 minutes ago as the future Mrs. Carter were now staring at her and then pointedly turning away, physically angling their bodies from her, and Alyssa felt the temperature of her entire future drop through the floor. And that was the moment Daniel finally looked at his phone. He pulled it out with a shaking hand. The screen was full. Notification after notification, stacked one on top of another, all from the firm, all time-stamped within the last 90 seconds. His thumb trembling opened the first one. It was from the Compensation Committee. Official. Formal. The language of it swam in front of his eyes, but the meaning cut through anyway. Acquisition review, clawback, correction of appointment, effective immediately, his promotion, his senior partnership. The title he'd worn for exactly 3 days, the title he'd thrown away his marriage for, the title that made him feel like he'd finally arrived. Revoked, rescinded, gone, as if it had never happened. "What?" Daniel breathed. He opened the next notification. The Halbrook account, the deal of his career, the client he'd built his whole future on. Reassigned. Transferred to another partner, effective immediately per a corporate directive from a holding company he'd never heard of. Gone. The next one, his firm credit line, suspended pending review. His corporate card, frozen. The next one, a notice from the bank about the mortgage account, a discrepancy, a correction, an entity he didn't recognize withdrawing its guarantee on a loan he thought he'd been paying for years. Daniel's legs went weak. He gripped the back of the chair. Every screen he opened told him the same impossible story. Everything he had, everything he thought he'd built, everything he thought was his by right of his own talent and ambition was being pulled out from under him in real time, one notification at a time, while the entire room stood applauding the woman he'd left. "Daniel!" Alyssa's voice was shrill with panic. "Daniel, what's happening? Why do you look like that? Say something." She grabbed his arm. "This is a nightmare. This whole thing is a nightmare. Tell me you didn't know. Tell me you didn't know she couldn't even say it. You said she was nothing. You told me she was a nobody. You told me she was beneath you." "I didn't know," Daniel choked. "I swear to God, Alyssa, I didn't know. 9 years, and she never said a word. She let me think, she let me believe. How could you not know?" Alyssa's voice climbed toward hysteria. "You were married to her. You lived with her. How do you not know your own wife is a billionaire's daughter?" And across the room, still receiving the applause of the most powerful people in the city, with the calm grace of a woman who had done this 1,000 times. Elena Whitmore turned very slowly and looked at the two of them standing at table 41, drowning. The applause was still going. Elena raised one hand, a small gesture, and it began to settle. Her father from the stage gave a slight nod, and the room, sensing that the true event of the evening was not yet finished, quieted to hear what came next. Elena walked toward table 41. She walked past the applauding senators and the shipping magnates and the judges, past the people who'd spent the last 10 minutes recalculating everything, and she walked directly to the table by the service door, where her husband stood, shattered, and his mistress stood ashen, and she stopped in front of them, and the entire room watched. "Daniel," Elena said, and her voice, though quiet, carried in the silence. "You're checking your phone. Is everything all right at work?" Daniel looked up at her, and his face was a ruin. "Elena, please. Whatever this is, whatever you're doing, I never meant—" "You made senior partner 3 days ago," Elena said, calm as still water. "Youngest in the firm's history. You told me your numbers were undeniable. You told me the world had finally decided it was your turn." She tilted her head. "How does it feel to have the world decide about you?" "You did this," Daniel whispered. "The clawback, the account, all of it. The firm your parent company got acquired last quarter," Elena said, "by a company called Meridian. Meridian is a subsidiary of the Whitmore Group, which means, Daniel, for the last 3 months, you've worked for my family. Your paycheck, your promotion, your precious Halbrook account, all of it flowed through a company I sit on the board of." She let that settle. "You've been working for me. You just didn't know it. The same way you've been living in my world for 9 years and never once knew it." Daniel's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "The mortgage you thought you were paying," Elena continued gently, relentlessly, "was covered by a trust with my name on it. The credit card that never made sense, the limit that was too high, the rate that was too good mine. The Halbrook deal you thought you closed through pure talent, a favor my father did as a courtesy 8 months ago over lunch." She watched each fact land like a blow. "Everything you thought you built, Daniel, everything you were so proud of, everything that made you feel important enough to look me in the eye and call me mediocre. I built it, I carried it, and I let you believe you did it yourself because I loved you and I wanted you to feel like a man who'd earned his life." Tears were running down Daniel's face now, and he didn't wipe them. "Elena, please." Alyssa, meanwhile, had been doing her own arithmetic, and her arithmetic led somewhere even more personal. "The hotel," she said faintly. "The suite, this week. I stayed at the—" She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. Elena turned to her unhurried. "The Meridian Grand. Yes, my family owns it. Outright. You've been posting from it all week. All those lovely photos about living your best life." A pause. "The suite was charged to a card. The card runs through a trust. My trust. You've been showing off a luxury that was funded, every dollar of it, by the family of the woman you called a nobody." Elena's voice never rose. It didn't need to. "You mocked my clothes in a boutique that leases its space from a property group I sit on the board of. You threatened me not to come to a gala hosted by my own father. You called me poor in a life I paid for standing on ground I own. Alyssa made a small sound, like the air going out of something. "So no," Elena said, "it's not a rented dress." The whole room was utterly silent now. 200 of the most powerful people in the city watching the quiet daughter of William Whitmore stand over the man who'd betrayed her, and the woman who'd mocked her, and dismantle their entire understanding of reality with nothing but the truth, delivered in a voice you'd use to comment on the weather. Daniel's phone buzzed one more time in his hand. He looked down at it, helpless, unable to stop himself. It was a message from the event security team forwarded through the firm, though he couldn't have known that. A notice. His guest, Alyssa Grant, was flagged for removal. Unauthorized presence. Her access to the event granted through his invitation, revoked effective immediately. 2 members of the event's security staff were already moving toward the table. Alyssa saw them coming. She saw the way the whole room had turned from her. She saw the partners' wives who'd been so warm to her 20 minutes ago, now watching her with open contempt. She saw Daniel, the man she'd bet her entire future on, crumbling into a puddle beside her, worth nothing, now less than nothing, a liability. And she understood all at once the full shape of what had happened to her. "Daniel," she said, and her voice had changed entirely, gone cold and sharp and calculating even in the middle of her ruin. "You told me you were somebody. You told me you were going places. You told me your wife was a nobody." She took a step back from him. "You're the nobody. You've always been the nobody. She was carrying you the whole time and you were too stupid to know it." "Alyssa!" Daniel reached for her. "Don't touch me," she snapped. "Don't you dare touch me. Do you have any idea what you've cost me? I introduced myself to those women as your future wife of a man who just got fired in front of the whole city. I'll never recover from this, never." Her eyes were wild now, darting for any exit, any way to salvage anything. "This is your fault, all of it. You did this to me." And Elena, watching the two of them turn on each other in the wreckage, felt the last soft thing inside her go quiet and still. She had loved this man once. She had built her whole small, beautiful life around the hope that he loved her back, the real her, the ordinary her. And this was what he was underneath. This was what they both were. Two people who'd stood in the middle of everything she'd given them and called it their own and mocked her for the gift. The security staff reached the table. "Miss Grant," one of them said quietly, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. Your access to this event has been revoked." "Get your hands off me," Alyssa hissed, but they didn't touch her. They simply flanked her, and the message was unmistakable. And 200 of the most powerful people in the city watched the glamorous woman who'd been so certain she'd won be walked toward the exit past every table she'd hoped to charm. At the last moment, Alyssa turned back. She looked at Elena, and all her contempt, all her cruelty, all her certainty had curdled into something small and desperate. "You planned this," she said. "You planned all of it. You let us walk right into it." Elena looked at her. "No," she said simply. "I just stopped protecting you. Both of you have been standing on a floor I built this whole time. Tonight I just stepped aside and let you feel how far the drop really is." Alyssa opened her mouth, but there was nothing left to say, and the security staff guided her at last toward the doors and out of the glittering room she'd been so sure would crown her, and out of the world she'd never for 1 second actually belonged to. That left Daniel, standing alone at table 41 by the service door, his phone still buzzing in his hand, his marriage gone, his mistress gone, his promotion gone, his client gone, his credit gone, and the whole city watching him understand 10 years too late exactly what he had thrown away. "Elena," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. If I'd known—" And Elena, standing tall in the center of the room that had always belonged to her, looked at the man she'd carried for 9 years and gave him the truest answer she had. "That's the whole problem, Daniel," she said quietly. "If you'd known I was rich, you'd have treated me like gold. But you didn't know. So you showed me exactly who you are when you thought I was nobody." She held his eyes. "And that's the man I'm divorcing." Daniel didn't leave right away. That was the thing Elena hadn't expected. He stood at table 41, long after Alyssa had been walked out, long after the room had, with the terrible efficiency of the powerful, moved on to their dinners and their conversations, pretending not to watch him the way you pretend not to watch a car accident on the side of the road. He stood there holding his dead phone, a man on an island in the middle of a sea that had already forgotten him. Elena had returned to the family table by the stage beside her father, and William Whitmore leaned toward her, his voice low. "He's still here. I see that. Do you want him removed?" Elena watched Daniel across the room. He was trying in his ruined way to have a conversation with the couple who'd been seated beside him, the couple who'd stopped listening to his Halbrook story an hour ago, and they were answering him in short, cold sentences, angling their bodies away, doing the math that everyone in the room had already done. Daniel Carter was finished. There was nothing to be gained from him now, and possibly something to be lost by being seen with him. He was radioactive. "No," Elena said. "Let him sit. Let him feel what it's like to be at the worst table in the room when nobody's protecting him anymore. He wanted to know what it felt like to be somebody in a room like this. Let him find out what it feels like to be nobody in it." Her father studied her. "That's a hard thing to watch, even for a man who earned it." "I watched him call me mediocre in my own kitchen," Elena said quietly. "I watched him tell me I'd embarrass him in his world. I've earned the right to watch this too." But even as she said it, something moved in her chest that she didn't like. Because the truth was, she had loved him. Not the man crumbling across the room, but the man she'd married, the young man with the crooked smile who used to bring her coffee in bed and talk about the future like it was a country they'd visit together. Somewhere along the way, that man had died, and this one had grown up in his place, hungry and cruel and blind. And Elena had kept loving the memory long after the man was gone. That was the part that hurt. Not losing Daniel, losing the version of him she'd been faithful to for years after he stopped existing. Across the room, Daniel finally stood. He couldn't take it anymore. The cold shoulders, the whispers, the phone that kept buzzing with new catastrophes. He looked toward the family table, toward Elena, and she watched him gather himself, watched him make a decision. He began to walk toward her, through the room, past the tables, and every conversation he passed dropped a notch as people watched the disgraced man cross the floor toward the woman who'd destroyed him. He stopped at the edge of the family table. Up close, he looked 10 years older than he had that morning in the hallway, adjusting his cufflinks, telling her she'd be turned away at the door. "Elena," he said, "can we talk, please, just for a minute, not here, somewhere? Anything you have to say." Elena said, "You can say right here." Daniel glanced at William Whitmore, who was watching him with the flat, patient gaze of a man who had ruined more dangerous people than Daniel Carter before breakfast. Daniel swallowed. Okay. He turned back to Elena. "I know what I did. I know how it looks. But you have to understand, I was under a lot of pressure. And Alyssa, she got in my head. She made me feel like..." "Stop." Elena's voice was quiet, but it cut clean through him. "Don't do that. Don't stand here and blame her. You made every choice yourself, Daniel. You said the words. Nobody put them in your mouth. Mediocre. Financially beneath me. You'd embarrass yourself in my world. Those were yours." She held his eyes. "The affair was yours. The cruelty was yours. Own it. At least give me that." Daniel's jaw worked. For a moment she thought he might finally at the very bottom of everything become a man who could simply say I was wrong and mean it. But the reflex was too deep in him. "I do own it," he said, and even now there was a defensiveness underneath it, a hand reaching for a railing. "But you have to see your part in this too, Elena. 9 years. 9 years you let me believe a lie. You let me walk around thinking I built our life, thinking I was providing for you. And the whole time you were laughing at me. I was not laughing at you." Elena's composure cracked just once, just enough for the pain to show through. "I was loving you. Do you understand the difference? I hid all of it because I wanted one thing in my life that was real. I wanted to know that someone loved me, Elena, not the money, not the name. I gave up being celebrated. I gave up being seen. I lived small and quiet in a modest house, and I cooked your dinners, and I remembered your mother's birthday every single year. And I did all of it gladly because I thought I had something money can't buy. I thought I had a man who loved me for me." Her voice dropped. "And then you looked at that woman, and I found out that the man I built my whole quiet life around didn't love Elena at all. He loved the life Elena gave him and thought he'd earned it, and the second he wanted a fancier life, he threw the real one in the trash." Daniel had no answer, because there was no answer. The couple at the next table had given up pretending not to listen. "You didn't fail because I hid the money," Elena said. "You failed because when you thought I was poor, you showed me contempt. That's the whole thing, Daniel. That's the entire story. A better man, a poorer man, a man with nothing, would have looked at a wife he thought was ordinary and treated her with love anyway. That man I'd have stayed with forever, money or no money. But you needed me to be impressive, to be worth kindness, and I wasn't impressive, so you were cruel." She sat back. "You've got your answer now about who I really am, but I've got mine about who you really are, and mine's the one that matters. I'm inate." For a long moment, Daniel just stood there. Then, quietly defeated, he asked the only question he had left. "What happens to me now?" Elena looked at him, and here was where she surprised even herself. "That depends on you," she said. "The promotion's gone. The Halbrook account's gone. You'll keep your job, a version of it, an entry-level version if you want it. Nobody's going to hand you anything ever again, not through me. The favors stopped tonight. The safety net's gone. For the first time in 9 years, Daniel, you're going to live on exactly what you actually earn, with exactly the talent you actually have, and no invisible hand smoothing the road." She paused. "It won't be the life you imagined, but it's the life you always claimed you built for yourself. Now you get to actually build it." Daniel closed his eyes. "And us?" "There is no us," Elena said gently. "There hasn't been for a long time. You ended it in the kitchen, and I'm just finishing the paperwork. The divorce will be clean. You'll get what's fair, what a court would give you, not $1 more, not $1 less. The house was never yours. The money was never yours. But you'll walk out with your freedom and your 2 hands, which is exactly what you had when I met you, and exactly what you always insisted was all a real man needed. She almost smiled, and it was almost kind. Prove it. Daniel opened his mouth one more time, and then mercifully he closed it. He understood finally that there was nothing here for him. No forgiveness to win no argument, to make no version of the night that ended with him getting to keep anything. He gave a small, broken nod, and he turned and walked out of the gala, out of the glittering room, out of the Whitmore world he'd spent his whole life trying to enter, and never once realized he'd been living inside. Outside, it had started to rain. Elena watched through the tall windows as Daniel stepped out into it. No car waiting, his corporate account, frozen, his cards declined, standing on the curb in the rain in his rented tuxedo. A senior partner for 3 days, a nobody again by nightfall. He tried to hail a cab. 3 passed him by. He stood there getting soaked, and Elena watched him, and she waited to feel triumphant. She didn't. What she felt watching him shrink in the rain was something quieter and heavier. Grief, maybe. Not for Daniel, for the years, for the girl she'd been who'd believed so hard that love could be simple, that if she just made herself small enough and ordinary enough, someone would love the person underneath the fortune. She'd spent 9 years testing that theory, and tonight she'd gotten her result, and the result was a man standing in the rain who'd never actually seen her at all. Her father's hand settled on her shoulder. "You did what you set out to do." "I did. But it doesn't feel the way you thought it would." Elena turned from the window. "No, it doesn't." William Whitmore nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had won many things in his life and learned the hard way that winning and healing were not the same. "It never does. That's the part nobody tells you. You can be completely right, completely justified, and it still costs you something to watch a person fall, even a person who deserves it." He squeezed her shoulder. "That's not weakness, Elena. That's the thing that separates you from them. Alyssa would be dancing right now. You're grieving. That's how I know I raised you right." Elena leaned into her father just for a moment, the way she used to when she was small. "I gave up 9 years, Dad. 9 years of being who I am, for a lie." "You gave up 9 years for a hope," her father corrected gently. "That's different. It's not foolish to want to be loved for yourself. It's the least foolish thing a person can want. The foolishness was all his for having a woman like you and being too small to see her." He turned her toward the room, toward the 200 powerful people who were even now glancing over, wanting a moment with her, wanting to be near the newly revealed heir. "But that part of your life is over, and this part is just beginning. Look at them. Every person in this room wants 5 minutes with Elena Whitmore. The question is what you're going to do with all of them." Elena looked at the room, and something shifted in her, a door closing on 9 years and another one much larger swinging open. Over the following weeks, the story of the gala moved through the city, the way these stories do, in whispers and in headlines and in the knowing looks exchanged over lunch. The tale had everything. The hidden heiress, the cheating husband humiliated in front of the whole city, the mistress walked out by security. It became for a season the thing everyone talked about, and Elena, who had spent 9 years avoiding exactly this kind of attention, found that she no longer minded it the way she'd feared she would. Because something had changed in her. She'd stopped hiding. And it turned out that the hiding had been costing her more than she ever understood. Priya noticed it first. "You're different," she said one morning 3 weeks after the gala as they went over the holdings. I don't know how to say it. You're louder. Not louder loud. Louder in the room. You take up your whole space now." Elena considered that. "I spent 9 years making myself smaller, so a man wouldn't feel threatened. I think I forgot I was allowed to be the size I actually am." The divorce moved quickly. Daniel, to his small credit, didn't fight it. He didn't have the resources to fight it even if he'd wanted to, but Elena suspected there was more to it than that. She suspected that some part of him somewhere underneath the wreckage of his ego had understood at last that he'd done something unforgivable, and that fighting for a bigger settlement would only prove one final time that he'd always been in it for the money. He signed the papers. He took what was fair. He moved into a small apartment across town, and he started over at the bottom with the 2 hands he'd always claimed were all a real man needed. Elena heard about him occasionally through the strange network of a city where everyone knew everyone. He'd taken an entry-level position at a smaller firm, one with no connection to the Whitmore empire, one where nobody knew his name or his story, one where he'd have to actually earn every inch. He was by all accounts working harder than he ever had. Whether that would make him a better man or just a more tired one, Elena couldn't say. That was his to figure out now. She'd removed her hand from his life, and what he built with it, or failed to build, was no longer her concern. Alyssa fared worse, and in a way that surprised no one who'd watched her at the gala. She'd bet everything on Daniel, on the life she thought he was about to give her, and when that life evaporated in a single night, she had nothing to fall back on. The luxuries she'd flaunted had all been borrowed one way or another from a well that had run dry the moment security walked her out. The credit cards, it turned out, had never been hers. The suite at the Meridian Grand, the designer bags, the whole glittering performance of wealth had been financed by Daniel on credit that flowed unknowingly from Elena's own trust. When that credit vanished, so did Alyssa's entire lifestyle. She'd been living quite literally on money that belonged to the woman she'd mocked, and now the bill had come due, and there was no one left to pay it. The partners' wives she'd tried so hard to charm made sure the story followed her. The woman who'd introduced herself as the future Mrs. Carter moments before Daniel Carter was destroyed in front of the entire city, became a cautionary tale, a punchline, a name people said with a small, cruel smile at parties. She lost her standing in the exact world she'd sold her soul to enter, and she lost it more completely than Elena could ever have arranged on purpose. She simply disappeared from it, dropped out of the circles she'd clawed her way into, and the city that had briefly found her fascinating forgot her within a season. Elena took no pleasure in any of it. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the quiet moments. She'd expected the aftermath to taste like victory, and instead it just tasted like an ending, clean and necessary, and a little sad the way endings are. She'd removed her protection from 2 people who'd stood on it and mocked her, and they'd fallen exactly as far as they'd always been from the ground. That was all. She hadn't pushed them. She'd simply stopped holding them up. "You keep saying that," Priya observed one afternoon. "I just stopped holding them up, like you didn't do anything." "Because I didn't do anything," Elena said. "That's the part everyone misses. I didn't ruin Daniel. I didn't ruin Alyssa. I just stopped subsidizing lives they hadn't earned. Everything they lost because it was never actually theirs. It was mine, and I let them borrow it, and when I stopped they had nothing because they'd built nothing." She looked out the window of her father's office high above the city, the higher than Daniel had ever managed to climb, even at the peak of his borrowed success. That's the whole lesson, if there is one. You can spend your whole life standing on someone else's foundation, calling it your own, mocking the very person who built it. But the day they step aside, you find out you were never standing on anything at all. The real change, though, the change that mattered, was the one happening inside Elena herself. For 9 years, she'd defined herself by a single question. Does he love the real me? She'd built her entire life around the answer. Hidden her fortune, shrunk her ambitions, made herself ordinary, all in service of that one desperate hope. And now the question was answered definitively, painfully, and she was free of it. Free of the need to be loved for being small. Free of the fear that her worth was somehow tangled up in whether a man could see past her money to the person underneath. Because here was the thing she finally understood, the thing it had taken 9 years and 1 catastrophic gala to learn. The money wasn't a disguise she wore over the real her. The money was part of her. Her sharpness, her patience, her ability to walk into a room and reorganize it without raising her voice. Her instinct for exactly when to hold a card and when to play it, these weren't separate from being a Whitmore. They were being a Whitmore. She'd spent 9 years treating her own power like something shameful, something to hide something that got in the way of being loved. And the truth was the opposite. Her power was one of the best things about her, and any man who couldn't love her with it, who could only love her without it, who needed her, diminished to feel like a man, that man had never loved her at all. He'd only loved the space her smallness made for his ego. She would never make herself small again, not for anyone. Her father saw it happening, and it moved him in a way he didn't have words for. He'd watched his daughter dim herself for nearly a decade, watched her hide her brilliance under a bushel for a man who wasn't worth her little finger, and he'd held his tongue because he'd promised to respect her choice. Now he watched her come back to life, watched her step into the fullness of who she was, and he began quietly to do the thing he'd been waiting 9 years to do. "I'm getting older, Elena," he said one evening over dinner at the estate. The estate she'd grown up in, the estate Daniel had never once set foot in. "The empire needs a future. It's needed one for a long time. I was starting to worry I'd have to hand it to a committee, to a board, to strangers who'd carve it up and sell it for parts." He looked at her across the table. "And then 3 weeks ago, I watched my daughter walk into a room full of the most powerful people in this city and take it over without saying a word. And I thought, there she is. There's the future. She's been here the whole time. She was just hiding." Elena set down her fork. "Dad, I'm not asking you to decide tonight," William said, "but I want you to start coming to the meetings, the real ones, the rooms where things actually get decided. I want you to learn the whole shape of it, everything I've built, everything your grandfather built before me. And when you're ready, when you actually want it, not because I'm pushing you, but because it's yours and you know it, I want you to take it." His voice roughened just slightly. "You spent 9 years being the perfect wife in the shadows for a man who didn't deserve you. Come out of the shadows now. Come build something that's actually yours, something no one can ever take away, because you'll have earned every inch of it yourself." Elena looked at her father, this man who'd built an empire, who could have ended Daniel with a phone call, and instead let her do it her own way, who'd waited 9 patient years for his daughter to come back to herself. And she felt for the first time in longer than she could remember the thing she'd spent 9 years chasing in the wrong place entirely. She felt seen, fully, not the small version, not the safe version. All of her, the sharpness and the power and the patience and the will, seen and wanted exactly as she was. "Okay," she said quietly, "I'll come to the meetings." Her father smiled, and there was something wet in his eyes that neither of them mentioned. "Good," he said. "That's good, Elena." And then softer, "Welcome home." That night, driving back from the estate, Elena passed the exit for the old neighborhood, the modest street where she'd lived her small, quiet life. On an impulse she didn't fully understand, she took it. She drove past the house she'd chosen and loved, and left the house where she'd been Mrs. Carter, where she'd made soup for sick neighbors, and remembered birthdays, and been for a while exactly the ordinary woman she'd wanted to be. The lights were off. The house sat empty now, waiting to be sold, and Elena parked across the street and looked at it for a long time, and she let herself feel the whole weight of what she'd buried there. 9 years of her life. A version of herself that had died, a hope that had turned out to be a lie. But she also felt something else, something she hadn't expected. Gratitude, because the small life hadn't all been a lie. The soup had been real. The remembered birthdays had been real. The person she'd been on this street, the kind, quiet woman who took care of people, that woman had been real too, and Elena didn't want to lose her entirely. She didn't have to become hard to become powerful. She didn't have to become Alyssa to defeat Alyssa. She could carry the kindness of Mrs. Carter into the boardrooms of Elena Whitmore and be both and be whole. That she realized was the real victory. Not Daniel in the rain, not Alyssa walked out by security. The real victory was that she'd come through 9 years of hiding and betrayal and public reckoning, and she hadn't let it turn her cruel. She was still herself. She was just finally all of herself. She started the car and pulled away from the curb, and she didn't look back at the house in the mirror. That chapter was closed. She'd mourned it, honored it, and let it go. Ahead of her, the city glittered full of rooms she now had every right to walk into, full of a future that was finally entirely her own. And Elena Whitmore drove toward it with both hands steady on the wheel, no longer hiding, no longer small, no longer waiting for anyone to give her permission to be exactly who she'd always been. The woman Daniel had called mediocre was about to become one of the most powerful people in the city. And she was going to do it as herself. Elena drove home that night, but she didn't sleep. She sat by the window of the penthouse her father kept for family, a home she'd barely used in 9 years, and she watched the city breathe below her, all those lights, All those rooms, all those lives. And for the first time in a very long time, she let herself think not about the past she was leaving, but about the future she was walking toward. It frightened her a little. 9 years of smallness had made her forget how large she was allowed to be. But underneath the fear was something warmer, something that felt like coming up for air after a long time underwater. The next morning, she went to her first real meeting. Not a courtesy meeting, not the kind where they showed the boss's daughter around and everyone smiled and nothing was said. A real one in the room on the top floor where the actual decisions got made, where her father sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by the people who ran the Whitmore empire, men and women who'd spent decades accumulating the kind of power that didn't announce itself. Elena walked in wearing a suit that fit the woman she actually was, and she felt every eye in the room take her measure. "Everyone," William said, "you all know who this is. My daughter, Elena. She's going to be sitting in on these meetings from now on, learning the business, eventually running it." He let that land watch the reassessments ripple around the table, the same reassessments she'd seen ripple through the gala. "I'd suggest you all get to know her. She's sharper than any of you. She's just been keeping it quiet for a while." There was a man at that table named Gregory Hale, the chief operating officer, a man who'd been with the company for 20 years and had Elena knew from the files Priya kept, been quietly positioning himself for a decade to inherit real control when William stepped back. He was smooth and gray and dangerous in the way of men who'd survived every purge, and he looked at Elena with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Wonderful," Hale said. "It's always good to bring family into the fold. Though I'll admit, Elena, forgive me, we've all been running this business a long time. It's complicated. There's a learning curve. Perhaps for the first few months you might want to just observe, get comfortable before we throw you into the deep end. No shame in easing in." It was said kindly. It was said with a smile. And it was Elena understood instantly exactly the same thing Daniel used to do. The gentle diminishment. The "you're not quite ready." The soft hand on the shoulder that was really a hand holding you down. 6 weeks ago, it might have worked on her. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a woman who made herself small so men wouldn't feel threatened. Not anymore. "That's generous, Gregory," Elena said pleasantly. "But I've actually already reviewed the last 3 years of the operational reports, including the Kessler acquisition you shepherded in the fall." She let a small pause open. "The one that's currently running 11% over projection with a margin structure that doesn't match what was presented to the board when it was approved. I had some questions about that, actually, but we can save those for when I'm easing in." The room went very still. Gregory Hale's smile stayed exactly where it was, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating. William Whitmore at the head of the table said nothing, but Elena caught the flicker at the corner of his mouth, the faint, fierce pride of a man watching his daughter draw first blood. "You've done your homework," Hale said. "I do my homework," Elena said. "I've always done my homework. I just used to keep the results to myself." She took her seat unhurried the same way she'd walked into the gala. "Please, continue. I'm just here to observe." But everyone at that table understood in that moment that she was not just there to observe. A new power had entered the room, and it had teeth, and it had patience, and it had already read the files. Gregory Hale, who'd spent 10 years planning to inherit a company from a distracted old man and his invisible daughter, understood that his math had just changed. The invisible daughter was not invisible anymore, and she'd come to the table knowing exactly where the bodies were buried. After the meeting, her father caught her in the hallway. "The Kessler numbers," he said quietly. "How long have you known?" "About the discrepancy a few weeks. Priya flagged it when I asked her to pull everything Hale had touched." Elena kept her voice low. "He's skimming Dad. Not crudely. He's too smart for that. But the margin structure on Kessler doesn't add up, and the difference is going somewhere, and I'd bet it's going to an entity he controls 3 or 4 layers down. It's the same trick, honestly. Hide the real ownership behind enough shells and nobody looks. I know that trick. I used it myself for 9 years to hide a mortgage." William stopped walking. He looked at his daughter with an expression she'd never quite seen on him before. Something between astonishment and grief and joy. "I've had that man at my right hand for 20 years, he said slowly. "I trusted him. And you walked into your first meeting and saw straight through him in 6 weeks. I've spent 9 years watching a man convince himself he'd earned things he was actually being handed. Elena said. "I got very good at spotting the gap between what people claim they built and what they actually built. Hale claims Kessler, but he didn't build those numbers. He's hiding them." She met her father's eyes. "The same way Daniel didn't build his life. He was just standing on mine. Hale's standing on yours. I know exactly what that looks like now." Her father was quiet for a long moment, and then he did something he hadn't done since she was a child. He put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her the way you look at someone you're seeing clearly for the first time. "You know what I kept thinking all those years you were hiding? I kept thinking, what a waste. What a waste of a mind like that on soup and birthdays and a man who couldn't see her." He shook his head. "I was wrong. It wasn't a waste. It was training. You learn to see people. You learn to wait. You learn to let them show you who they are before you moved. 9 years of watching a small, cruel man think he was a big, important one taught you to see the exact same thing in a big, important room." His voice roughened. "You're going to be better at this than I ever was, Elena. You already are." Over the following months, Elena did not ease in. She moved through the empire like water, finding every crack, learning everything, missing nothing. She sat in the meetings and she read every file and she asked the questions no one wanted asked, and slowly, inevitably, the shape of the company began to reorganize itself around her the way the gala had. People who'd dismissed her started seeking her out. People who'd underestimated her started quietly updating their estimates. And Gregory Hale, watching his long game collapse, made the mistake that men like him always make. He decided the invisible daughter was a threat that needed to be handled. He came to her office one evening when he thought the floor was empty with a smile and a folder and a proposition. "Elena," he said, sitting without being asked, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. Let me be direct. You're clearly talented, but you're new, and this world is unforgiving, and there are a lot of ways for a newcomer to stumble." He slid the folder across her desk. "I've been thinking, you and I could be very useful to each other. There are things I know about how this company really runs that could take you years to learn on your own. I could be a friend to you, or—" He let the word hang. "Well, I'd hate for us to be anything else." Elena looked at the folder. She didn't open it. "Is that a threat, Gregory?" "It's an offer." His smile never wavered. "Between two people who understand power. Your father's an old man, Elena. He won't be running this forever. When he steps back, there's going to be a question of who really controls things. I've been positioning for that for a long time. I'd rather have you as an ally than an obstacle. But make no mistake, if you're an obstacle, I've moved obstacles before." Elena sat back in her chair, and she felt something in her go very calm and very cold. The same stillness she'd felt in the kitchen the night Alyssa insulted her, the same stillness she'd carried into the gala. "Let me tell you something, Gregory," she said. 6 weeks into this job, I found the Kessler discrepancy. Do you want to know what I found in the 6 months since? She reached into her own desk and pulled out a folder of her own thicker than his and set it down between them. "The shell entity in Delaware, the one that received the Kessler overage, the 3 you set up behind it, the transfers timed carefully to look like vendor payments, the board presentation you doctored, the 2 junior analysts you had reassigned when they got too close. I found all of it." She tapped the folder. "It's all in here. It's all documented. And copies are in 3 places you'll never find. Gregory Hale's smile finally at last came off his face. "You came in here to threaten me," Elena said quietly. "You thought I was the invisible daughter, the newcomer, the girl who'd stumble. You made exactly the same mistake Daniel made and Alyssa made and everyone makes with me. You looked at someone who doesn't shout, and you decided she must be weak." She leaned forward. "I'm going to give you the same thing I gave them. A chance to feel exactly how far the drop is. You're going to resign, tonight, effective immediately. You're going to sign a full return of everything you took, plus a confession that stays in my safe as insurance. And you're going to disappear from this company quietly and never come near it or me or my father again. In exchange, I won't hand this folder to the authorities, and you won't spend the next 15 years in a federal prison." "You can't—" "I can," Elena said. "That's the thing you never understood, Gregory. I don't have to shout. I don't have to threaten. I just have to be right and be patient and have done my homework. And I always do my homework." She slid a pen across the desk. "You've got about 10 seconds to decide whether you're smart enough to take the mercy I'm offering. Daniel wasn't. Alyssa wasn't. I genuinely hate for you to make it 3. Gregory Hale looked at the folder. He looked at the pen. He looked at the calm, patient, utterly certain woman across the desk, the woman he'd walked in to intimidate, and he understood the way Daniel had understood at table 41 that he'd catastrophically misjudged who he was dealing with. His hand, when he reached for the pen, was shaking. He signed, and Gregory Hale, 20-year veteran of the Whitmore Empire heir, a parent to real power, walked out of Elena's office that night, a ruined man undone not by a shout or a scandal, but by a quiet woman who'd simply done her homework and waited for him to show her who he was. When it was done, Elena sat alone in her office for a long time, the 2 folders on the desk in front of her, and she thought about the shape of the last year, Daniel in the rain. Alyssa walked out by security, and now Hale signing his own erasure with a shaking hand. 3 people who'd looked at her quiet and mistaken it for weakness. 3 people who'd learned the same lesson far too late. Her phone buzzed. Her father. "I heard Hale resigned," William said. "Tonight. Very suddenly. Very quietly." A pause. "Care to tell me what happened?" "He showed me who he was," Elena said. "So I removed his access, same as always." There was a long silence on the line. And then her father laughed, a real laugh, warm and astonished and full of something that sounded almost like relief. 20 years I carried that snake at my right hand," he said, "and you handled him in one evening without raising your voice." Another pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone soft. "The company's yours whenever you want it, Elena. I mean it. I'm not worried about the future anymore. For the first time in years, I'm not worried at all. I'm going to sleep like a baby tonight, because I finally know exactly who's going to protect everything I built." He paused one last time. "You didn't just come home. You came home and made it safer than I ever kept it. Thank you, sweetheart." Elena hung up. She looked out the window at the city, her city now in every way that mattered. Somewhere out there, Daniel was in his small apartment starting over. Somewhere out there, Alyssa had vanished into the ordinary life she'd been so desperate to escape. And here she was at the top of everything, not because she'd been born to it, though she had, but because when the moment came, she'd been ready. She'd done her homework, she'd waited, and she'd stopped at last, making herself small. She gathered the 2 folders, locked them in her safe, and turned off the lights. On her way out, she caught her own reflection in the dark glass of the office window, and she stopped and she looked at herself for a moment. Not Mrs. Carter in her cardigan. Not the invisible daughter. Elena Whitmore, whole and unhidden, the most dangerous kind of person there, is the kind who never needed to prove her worth because she'd always known exactly what it was. The woman Daniel had called mediocre stood at the top of an empire, and she'd gotten there by being from the very beginning exactly who she was. A year after the gala, Elena Whitmore stood at the head of the long table on the top floor in the seat that had been her father's and ran the meeting herself. William was there still, but he sat to her right now, a hand on the tiller rather than the tiller itself, and he watched his daughter command a room full of the most powerful people in the company with the same quiet authority that had emptied the ballroom the night she first stepped out of the shadows. He'd handed her more of the empire month by month, not because age forced him to, but because he'd finally found someone he trusted more than himself. The transition had not been simple. Removing Gregory Hale had left a hole at the top of the company, and holes at the top of companies attract vultures. In the months after Hale's quiet exit, others had tested her the way you test a new lock. There'd been a faction on the board that thought a 30-something woman who'd spent a decade playing housewife had no business holding real power. There'd been a competitor who'd smelled instability and moved to acquire a piece of the Whitmore holdings while the succession looked shaky. There'd been leaks and whisper campaigns, and one memorable afternoon when a senior director had tried to organize a vote of no confidence behind her back. Elena had handled all of it the same way, patiently, quietly, by doing her homework and letting each of them show her exactly who they were before she moved. The director who'd organized the vote found himself outmaneuvered before he'd secured a third of the room, because Elena had known about the effort before he'd finished his first phone call and had spent the intervening days making quiet arrangements he never saw coming. The competitor who'd moved on the holdings discovered too late that the piece he thought was vulnerable had been quietly fortified and that the Whitmore Group had, in the same window, acquired a controlling interest in one of his own subsidiaries. He'd come to take a bite and left having lost a limb. The board learned collectively the lesson that Daniel and Alyssa and Hale had each learned individually. You did not mistake Elena Whitmore's quiet for weakness. The people who understood that early prospered under her. The people who understood it late or never found themselves one by one gently removed from the rooms where things were decided. She never shouted. She never had to. She simply methodically removed access from anyone who couldn't be trusted with it, until the only people left at the top were people who'd earned the right to be there. "You've made this place harder than I ever did," her father told her one evening, not for the first time, as they looked over the quarterly numbers. "Harder and stronger. I built an empire. You're building a fortress." "I'm building something no one can take," Elena said. "That's different. You built something enormous and trusted the wrong people to help you hold it. I watched what that cost you with Hale. I'm not making that mistake." She looked at him. "I spent 9 years trusting the wrong person with everything I was. I'm never doing it blind again. Trust is earned now, every inch of it, from everyone." Her father heard the scar underneath the strategy, and he didn't argue with it. He just nodded. "That's a hard way to live, Elena." "It's the only way I know how to live now," she said. And then softer because it was true and she wanted him to know it. "But it's not a cold way. I trust you completely. I trust Priya. I've built a small circle of people who've actually earned it, and inside that circle I'm the same woman who made soup for sick neighbors. I didn't lose her. I just stopped handing her to people who'd throw her away." That distinction mattered to Elena more than anything in the year after the gala. She'd been terrified in the beginning that stepping into power would turn her into the thing she'd defeated, that she'd become an Alyssa hard and grasping and cruel, that the woman who'd remembered birthdays would calcify into someone who only remembered leverage. And there'd been moments dismantling Hale, outmaneuvering the board, when she'd felt the pull of it, the seduction of pure power untethered from any warmth. But she'd held on to Mrs. Carter. She'd insisted on it. And the way she insisted was this. She used the empire more and more for things that had nothing to do with her ego and everything to do with the woman she'd been on that quiet suburban street. She started with the foundation. The Whitmore Charity Gala had always raised money, but the money had gone where such money usually goes, to safe, respectable causes that generated good press and grateful photographs. Elena took the foundation apart and rebuilt it. She poured it into the kinds of things Mrs. Carter would have cared about. Housing for families a single bad month away from the street. Legal aid for people being crushed by systems they couldn't afford to fight. Programs for women trapped in the exact kind of diminishment she'd lived in for 9 years. Women who'd made themselves small for men who told them their worth was conditional. She funded shelters. She funded second chances. She funded the quiet, unglamorous work of catching people before they fell. "You could get a lot more publicity," a foundation director told her once, "if we focused on the flashier initiatives, the ones with celebrity involvement, the galas, the ribbon cuttings." "I don't want publicity," Elena said. "I spent 9 years invisible. I know exactly what it's like to be a person nobody important notices. There are millions of them out there, and most of them aren't hiding a fortune. They're just poor and tired and treated like they're mediocre by people who never bothered to look closer." Her voice was quiet but certain. "I don't want to help the people who'll thank me in front of cameras. I want to help the people nobody's watching. The way I wish someone had seen me." And that, in the end, was the shape of Elena Whitmore's power. Not vengeance, not spectacle. The reckoning at the gala had been necessary, a door that had to be slammed on 9 years of being underestimated, but it was not who she became. Who she became was a woman who used enormous power quietly in the dark for people who'd never know her name, exactly the way she'd once used her fortune quietly for a husband who'd never known to thank her. The difference was that now she gave it to people who needed it instead of a man who mocked her for it. And the giving healed something in her that revenge never could have touched. She thought about Daniel sometimes, less and less as the year went on, but sometimes. She heard through the network of a city that never fully forgot a story, that good, that he was still at the small firm, still grinding, still starting over. The word was that he'd changed some. that the arrogance had been beaten out of him, replaced by something quieter and more careful, that he'd been heard more than once telling younger colleagues not to mistake luck for talent, not to assume the ground under their feet was theirs just because they were standing on it. Whether that was genuine growth or just the caution of a man who'd been badly burned, Elena couldn't say, and she found to her mild surprise that she no longer needed to know. He reached out to her exactly once, about 10 months after the gala. A letter handwritten forwarded through her attorney because he had no other way to reach her. She almost didn't read it, but she did in the end, sitting alone one evening, and it was shorter than she'd expected. He didn't ask for anything. That was the first surprise. He didn't ask for money or a reference or a second chance or even forgiveness. He just said that he'd spent the year thinking about what she'd told him at the gala, the thing about how he'd shown her who he was when he thought she was nobody. He said he'd realized she was right, that the worst thing he'd ever learned about himself was that his kindness had been conditional, that he'd rationed his respect based on what a person could do for him, and that he'd only discovered this about himself after it cost him the one person who'd loved him without conditions. He said he wasn't writing to win her back, that he knew that door was closed and deserved to be. He was writing, he said, because he owed her the acknowledgement. He'd been carried for 9 years by a woman he'd called mediocre, and he'd never once said thank you because he'd never known to. He knew now. And he was sorry, and that was all. Elena read it twice. Then she set it down and sat with it for a long time. She didn't write back. There was nothing to write back. The letter didn't reopen anything or heal anything or change anything, but she found sitting there that she was glad he'd written it. Not for her sake, for his. Because a man who could finally see the thing he'd been blind to, who could name it without asking for anything in return, was a man who might eventually become someone worth being. She hoped he would. She genuinely hoped it. And then she put the letter in a drawer and closed it, and closed with it the last small door that had still been open even a crack on 9 years of her life. She never thought about Alyssa at all. There was nothing there to think about. Alyssa had wanted a life she hadn't earned, and had lost it the moment the person actually paying for it stepped aside. She'd been a symptom, not a cause. The affair, the cruelty, the mockery, and the boutique, none of it had been about Elena at all. It had all been about Alyssa's bottomless hunger to be someone important and her willingness to step on anyone she'd decided was beneath her to get there. She'd stepped on the wrong person, that was all. Elena felt neither triumph nor pity when she thought of her, which was rarely because Alyssa had turned out to be exactly as small as she'd always accused Elena of being, and there was nothing in that worth the energy of a second thought. The real story, the one that mattered, was never about Daniel or Alyssa, or even Hale. Elena understood that clearly now from the height of a year's distance. Those three had just been the mirrors. The story was about a woman who'd spent 9 years believing that to be loved, she had to be less than she was, who'd hidden her power because she'd been taught somewhere along the way that a woman's strength was a thing to apologize for a thing that made her hard to love. She'd shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and she'd called it love, and she'd been proud of the sacrifice, and the whole time she'd been slowly erasing herself for a man who'd have thrown her away the instant a shinier option appeared. The gala hadn't just been the night she took everything back from Daniel. It had been the night she stopped erasing herself. The night she looked at the full size of who she was, the power and the sharpness and the fortune and the will, and decided finally that none of it was something to hide. That the woman who could walk into a room and reorganize it without raising her voice was not a monster to be ashamed of, but simply herself fully expressed. She'd spent 9 years believing her power was the thing standing between her and being loved. And the truth that had cost her 9 years and one catastrophic marriage to learn was that her power was one of the best things about her, and anyone who couldn't love her with it had never loved her at all. She would never make herself small again. She'd promised herself that in the car outside the empty house, and in the years since she'd kept the promise 100 times over, in 100 rooms full of people who'd tried to shrink her back down to a size that made them comfortable. Every time she'd stayed exactly the size she was. And every time the room had rearranged itself around her, because that was what happened in the end, when a person stopped apologizing for taking up space. On the anniversary of the gala, her father hosted it again, the same event, the same glittering room, the same 200 of the most powerful people in the city. But this year, Elena did not step out of the shadows because there were no more shadows for her to step out of. This year, she stood beside her father from the beginning, greeting the guests running the room, the acknowledged heir and increasingly, the acknowledged power behind the entire Whitmore name. There was no dramatic reveal because there was nothing left to reveal. Everyone knew exactly who she was. And at some point in the evening, standing near the center of the room, the center where a year ago, Daniel had so badly wanted to sit, Elena caught her own reflection in one of the tall windows the way she had that night in her office, and she stopped and she looked. The woman looking back at her was not Mrs. Carter in her cardigan, and she was not the invisible daughter, and she was not the trembling wife who'd absorbed insults at her own kitchen table. She was Elena Whitmore, whole and unhidden, and entirely herself, a woman who'd walked through betrayal and diminishment and public reckoning and come out the other side not broken, not hardened into cruelty, but simply finally complete. Her father found her there. He followed her gaze to the reflection, and he understood what she was looking at because he'd been waiting 9 years to see her look at herself that way. "You know what I keep thinking," he said quietly. "I keep thinking about that man standing in the rain a year ago, finally understanding what he'd thrown away. And I keep thinking he never actually understood it. Even then, even in the rain." William watched his daughter's reflection. He thought he'd thrown away a fortune, a billionaire's daughter, access, status. He was standing in the rain, grieving the money. He shook his head slowly. "He never once grieved you. The actual you. The woman who made soup for sick neighbors and remembered his mother's birthday every year. He never even knew that woman was the prize. To the very end, he thought the prize was the bank account. I know," Elena said softly. "That's the thing that should haunt him if he ever gets wise enough to feel it," her father went on. "Not that he lost a rich wife, that he had a good woman, a genuinely good woman, and he was too small to see her, and he only started paying attention the moment she turned out to be useful. You could put every dollar of this empire in front of a man like that, and he'd still never understand what he actually lost, because what he lost was never for sale." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching her own reflection, and then she said the thing she'd come over the course of a very long year to understand as the truest thing she knew. "The most dangerous mistake a person can make," she said, "is underestimating someone who never needed to prove her worth." She turned from the window and looked at her father. "I spent 9 years letting a man believe I was mediocre because I wanted to see if he'd love me anyway. And he showed me he wouldn't. That's the whole story, Dad. I didn't take revenge on Daniel. I didn't scream at him or ruin him out of spite. I just stopped holding up a life he hadn't earned and had the gall to mock. I removed my access. And his entire world collapsed, not because I destroyed it, but because it was never actually his. It was always mine. He was just standing on it, calling it his own, telling me I was standing beneath him." "Anatini-san," her father nodded. He'd heard her say versions of it before, but it landed different tonight on the anniversary in the room where it had all come apart and come together. "And the best part," Elena said, and here something almost like peace moved across her face, "is that I didn't have to become cruel to do it. I didn't have to become Alyssa to beat Alyssa. I didn't have to become Hale to remove Hale. I just had to stop apologizing for being exactly who I am. That's all it ever took. Not rage, not spectacle, just refusing finally to make myself small enough for small people to feel comfortable." She looked out at the glittering room, at the empire that was hers now, at the future, stretching out ahead of her entirely her own. "They all thought my quiet was weakness. Daniel, Alyssa, Hale. Every one of them looked at a woman who doesn't shout and decided she must be nobody. And every one of them found out too late that the quiet was never weakness. It was patience. It was power that didn't need an audience. It was a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and never once needed anyone else to confirm it." William Whitmore looked at his daughter, this woman he'd raised and lost to the shadows for 9 years and finally gratefully gotten back, and he felt something in his chest that was too large for words. Pride, yes, but more than pride. The specific peace of a man who has spent his whole life building something and finally knows it will be safe. "Your grandfather started this," he said. "I built it. But you, Elena, you're going to be the one who makes it mean something." He put his hand over hers. "I couldn't have asked for a better ending to my story than watching yours begin." Elena squeezed her father's hand. Then she turned back to the room, to the 200 powerful people who'd once watched her rise from the worst table in the house to the center of everything, and she stepped forward into it, into the light, into the life that had always been hers, and that she'd finally stopped hiding from. Somewhere across the city, a man who'd once called her mediocre was working late at a small firm starting over with the 2 hands he'd always claimed were all a real man, needed learning slowly the lesson she'd handed him in the rain. Somewhere, a woman who'd flaunted a borrowed fortune had vanished into the ordinary life she'd been so desperate to escape. And here at the center of the room stood the woman they'd both underestimated, whole and powerful, and entirely herself. Mourning nothing, apologizing for nothing, small no longer. Elena Whitmore had never taken her revenge with anger. She'd never had to. She'd simply removed her access from the people who mistook her kindness for weakness and her silence for surrender, and watched their borrowed worlds collapse into the nothing they'd always been built on. And then she'd taken everything she was, all the power she'd spent 9 years hiding, and all the kindness she'd refused to let anyone take. And she'd built a life so completely her own that no one would ever again be able to make her feel like less than exactly what she was. The woman they called mediocre became the most powerful person in the city, and she did it without ever once raising her voice. 3 years after the gala, on a gray afternoon that carried the first real cold of autumn, Elena Whitmore did something she had not done in a very long time. She made soup, not for a fundraiser, not for a photograph. She stood in the kitchen of a small house she'd quietly bought back a year earlier, the modest house on the quiet suburban street where she'd once been Mrs. Carter, and she chopped carrots and celery on the same counter where Daniel had once told her she was mediocre, and she made soup for a neighbor who was sick. She'd never sold the house in the end. She'd bought it back the moment it went on the market, and she kept it. And every few weeks, she came here alone and lived for an afternoon. The small, quiet life she'd once believed was a prison she needed to escape into her real self. She'd learned over 3 years that it hadn't been a prison at all. It had been a part of her, and a woman was allowed to be more than one thing. Priya thought she was strange for it. "You run one of the largest holding companies in the country," she'd said once, "and you spend your Saturdays bringing chicken soup to a retired school teacher 2 doors down." "The school teacher's name is Margaret," Elena had answered, "and her husband died in the spring, and nobody checks on her, and she was the first person to bring me a casserole when Daniel and I moved in 9 years ago. I remember things like that. I always have." She'd smiled. "You can be powerful and still be the kind of person who remembers a casserole, Priya. In fact, I think that might be the only kind of powerful person worth being." That afternoon, ladling soup into a container to carry down the street, Elena's phone buzzed. She almost didn't look. But she did, and when she saw the name on the screen, she went very still. It was Daniel. Not a letter this time, forwarded through an attorney. A text sent directly to a number he shouldn't have had, which meant someone had given it to him, which meant he'd asked. She stared at it for a long moment before she opened it, and when she did, it was short the way his letter had been. "I know I have no right to reach out. I heard through a mutual friend that you kept the old house. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say I drove past it last week the first time in 3 years, and I sat outside it for an hour, thinking about the man I was in that house and the man I've been trying to become since. I'm not that man anymore. I don't expect that to mean anything to you. But I wanted you to know that the woman who made soup for the whole neighborhood was the best thing I ever had, and I finally understand that it had nothing to do with money. I hope you're well, Elena. I mean it. That's all. You'll never hear from me again. Elena set down the ladle. She read it twice and then a third time, and she was surprised to find that her eyes had gone hot, not because she wanted him back. That door had closed years ago, and she felt no draft from it now. But because there was something in the message that told her the thing she'd hoped 3 years ago when she read his letter and put it in a drawer. The thing was true. He'd actually changed. Not into someone who deserved her. That was a bridge long collapsed, but into someone who could finally see the world clearly. he'd finally understood the lesson she'd handed him in the rain. The lesson it had taken losing everything to teach him. That her worth had never been in the fortune. That the best thing he'd ever had was a woman who made soup for sick neighbors, and he'd called her mediocre and thrown her away, and it had taken him 3 years and the total collapse of his old life to understand what he'd actually lost. She thought for a long moment about whether to answer. In the end, she wrote back only one line. "I'm well, Daniel. I hope you find the life you're building. Take care of yourself." No warmth beyond ordinary kindness. No opening, but no cruelty either. She'd promised herself years ago that she would not become hard, that she would not let what Daniel and Alyssa and Hale had tried to make her be the thing she became. And a woman who could not offer even one line of plain human decency to a man who'd finally genuinely understood his own failure, that woman would have lost something more important than any fortune. So she sent the line. And then she blocked the number, gently, permanently, and finished ladling the soup and carried it down the street to Margaret, who cried a little at the door and held Elena's hand and said, "You know you're the only one who ever comes." "I know," Elena said, sitting down at the old woman's kitchen table. "That's why I come." That was the thing about Elena Whitmore 3 years into being the most powerful person in the city. She had not forgotten how it felt to be the person nobody came for. She never would. And she'd built her entire life, her real life, the one underneath the empire around, making sure that as few people as possible had to feel it. The foundation had grown into something that genuinely changed the shape of the city. Not through galas and ribbon cuttings, but through the quiet, unglamorous work Elena had insisted on from the beginning. The housing initiative had kept thousands of families off the street. The legal aid program had won cases that changed laws. The program for women, the one closest to her heart, the one for women who'd made themselves small for men who told them their worth was conditional, had grown into a network that stretched across the state, a network of shelters and second chances and quiet hands reaching out to catch people before they fell. She never put her name on any of it. She'd learned the value of working in the shadows a long time ago, and she'd finally found the right use for it. She gave the way she'd once given to Daniel quietly, invisibly, without needing thanks. Except now she gave it to people who needed it, and it healed her instead of hollowing her out. Her father had stepped back almost entirely by then. William Whitmore, who'd spent his whole life building an empire and worrying who would protect it, spent his days now in a state of contentment that surprised even him. He gardened, he read, he came to the small house on the quiet street sometimes and sat with Elena while she made soup, and he told her stories about her mother and about her grandfather and about the long, strange road that had brought the Whitmore name to where it was. And he watched his daughter with an expression of such complete peace that it sometimes made her have to look away. "I spent 40 years afraid," he told her one afternoon in the small kitchen watching her chop vegetables. "Afraid it would all fall apart, afraid I'd hand it to the wrong person, afraid all that work would come to nothing after I was gone." He shook his head slowly. "And then you walked into that ballroom 3 years ago and took over a room full of the most dangerous people in the city without saying a word, and I stopped being afraid. Just like that, overnight, for the first time in 40 years. He reached over and put his weathered hand over hers the way he had at the gala. "You gave me that, Elena. You didn't just take over the company. You gave an old man the first peaceful years of his life. Do you have any idea what that's worth?" Elena set down her knife and covered his hand with hers, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. There was, in the end, one more piece to Elena's story, and it came the way the best things in her life had always come quietly, unexpectedly, without her chasing it. His name was Thomas. He ran one of the non-profits her foundation funded, the housing initiative, and Elena had met him a dozen times in a purely professional capacity before she ever noticed him as anything else. He was not wealthy. He was not powerful. He drove an old car and wore the same 2 jackets in rotation, and had never once in all the time she'd met him seemed to have the faintest idea who she actually was, beyond a name on a foundation. He treated her the way he treated everyone, with a kind of unhurried warmth, and he argued with her respectfully, but without deference about how the housing money should be spent, because he cared more about the families than about impressing the woman who signed the checks. It was the arguing honestly that undid her. 9 years with a man who'd only respected her when he thought she was useful. And here was a man who pushed back on her, challenged her, told her she was wrong to her face about the allocation of funds, and did it without the faintest awareness that she could end his entire program with a phone call. He didn't defer to her power, because he didn't seem to register that she had any. He just saw a woman who cared about the same things he cared about, and he treated her like an equal. And it was, Elena realized one evening with something like a shock, exactly the thing she'd spent 9 years trying and failing to find with Daniel. She was careful. She'd learned to be careful in the hardest possible way. She didn't tell him who she really was, not fully, not the scale of it, for a long time. She let him get to know Elena first, the woman, the one who made soup and remembered casseroles and cared about housing families. And she watched the way she'd learned to watch, to see who he was before she moved. And who he was, it turned out, was a good man, not a perfect one, a real one. A man whose kindness was not conditional, who treated the janitor at his nonprofit with the same warmth he treated Elena, who'd spent his whole life doing quiet, unglamorous work for people who could never repay him for no reason other than that it was the right thing to do. The exact opposite of Daniel in every way that had ever mattered. Where Daniel had rationed his respect based on what a person could do for him, Thomas gave his freely to everyone as though it cost him nothing, because to him it did cost nothing. It was just who he was. When she finally told him the truth, the whole truth, the empire and the fortune and the scale of what she actually was, she braced herself. She'd learned to brace herself. She half expected to watch his eyes change, the way people's eyes always changed, to see the recalculation, the sudden new warmth, the man deciding she was worth more, now that he knew what she was worth. His eyes didn't change at all. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay." And then after another moment, "Does this mean you're going to keep arguing with me about the West Side allocation, or does being a billionaire mean you get to win arguments now?" Elena laughed, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't laughed in years. "It doesn't mean I get to win arguments." "Good," Thomas said, "because you're still wrong about the West Side." And then gentler, seeing something in her face, "Hey, is that why you didn't tell me you thought it would change things?" "Everyone it changes things for," Elena said quietly. "You have no idea. My whole life people find out what I am and they change. They get warmer, or they get scared, or they start performing for me. I spent 9 years married to a man who only respected me when he thought I was useful." She looked at him. "I needed to know who you were before you knew what I was. I needed to know it was real." Thomas took that in, and then he said the thing that told her finally completely that it was safe. "Elena," he said, "I've known you were a Whitmore for about 2 years. It was in the foundation paperwork. I just didn't think it was any of my business, and I figured if it mattered to you, you'd bring it up." He shrugged, almost embarrassed. "I liked you because you argue with me about housing policy, and you clearly actually care whether those families have somewhere to live. The money was never the interesting part. Honestly, it was kind of the least interesting part." Elena stared at him. 2 years. He'd known for 2 years, and it had changed nothing, because to him, it had never been the point. She'd spent 9 years hiding her fortune to find a man who'd love her without it, and here was a man who'd known about it the whole time and simply hadn't cared because he'd been too busy loving the actual person. She married him a year later in a small ceremony at the estate, with her father giving her away, and it was nothing like the wedding she'd had with Daniel. There was no illusion to maintain, no fortune to hide, no version of herself to perform. She stood at the front of that room as exactly who she was, all of it, the power and the fortune and the kindness and the will. And she married a man who saw all of it and loved the woman more than any of it. William Whitmore cried openly through the whole thing, and afterward he pulled Thomas aside and said something quiet to him that Thomas never fully repeated, though he told Elena later that it had ended with, "Thank you for seeing her." They had a daughter eventually, and Elena, holding her newborn in the same small house on the quiet street where she'd once believed her real self was trapped, made a promise to the sleeping child in her arms. She promised that this little girl would never be taught that her strength was something to apologize for, that she would never learn to make herself small so that small people could feel comfortable, that she would grow up knowing all the way down in her bones that her worth was not conditional, not on a fortune, not on a man, not on anything outside herself, that she was allowed to be exactly the size she was. "She's going to be dangerous," her father said, looking down at his granddaughter, and there was nothing but joy in it. "She's going to be free," Elena corrected softly. "That's more dangerous than anything." Years later, when the little girl was old enough to ask questions, she asked her mother once why they kept the small plain house when they had so many bigger ones. And Elena sat her daughter down at the old kitchen counter, the counter where a man had once called her mediocre, the counter where she'd made soup for a whole neighborhood, and she told her the truth, the whole shape of it, in words a child could understand. She told her that a long time ago her mother had been married to a man who thought that money was what made a person worth loving, that he'd looked at Elena when he thought she was ordinary and treated her like she was nothing, and that when he found out she was rich, it was too late because by then he'd already shown her exactly who he was. She told her daughter that the most important lesson she'd ever learned was that a person's worth had nothing to do with their fortune, and that the most dangerous mistake anyone could make was to underestimate a quiet person, because quiet was not the same as weak and kindness was not the same as small. "So what happened to the man?" her daughter asked. "He learned," Elena said. "Eventually, the hard way, he lost everything he thought made him important, and he had to start over with nothing, and somewhere in there he finally understood what he'd thrown away." She brushed her daughter's hair back from her face. "I didn't punish him, sweetheart. People think I did, but I didn't. I just stopped holding up a life he hadn't earned, that's all. When you stop carrying someone who never thanked you for the carrying, and they fall, that's not revenge, that's just gravity." "That's kind of sad," her daughter said. "It is a little sad," Elena agreed. "But here's the part that isn't sad." She smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had walked through the fire and come out whole. "Because that man threw me away when he thought I was ordinary, I found out the truth about him before I wasted my whole life on him. And because I found out the truth, I ended up here, in this kitchen, with you. Married to a man who loved me before he knew I had a single dollar, running something that helps thousands of people, whole and happy and never again pretending to be smaller than I am." She kissed her daughter's forehead. "The worst thing that ever happened to me turned out to be the door to the best thing. That's not sad. That's the happiest ending there is." And it was. Because in the end, Elena Whitmore's story was never really about the man who betrayed her, or the mistress who mocked her, or the fortune she'd hidden, or the empire she'd inherited. It was about a woman who spent 9 years believing she had to be less than she was to be loved, and who finally learned at enormous cost that the love worth having was the kind that wanted her at her full size. She'd stopped hiding. She'd stopped shrinking. She'd stopped apologizing for the space she took up in the world. And the moment she did, everything false in her life collapsed, and everything real came rushing in to fill the space it left behind. She never took her revenge with anger. She never needed to. She simply removed her access from everyone who mistook her worth and let their borrowed worlds fall away and kept only the people and the life that had been real all along. And what remained, when everything false had fallen away, was a woman standing at her full height in a small kitchen on a quiet street, powerful and kind and entirely herself, holding her daughter, having built a life that no one could ever take, because she had earned every inch of it by finally simply refusing to be anyone but exactly who she was. The woman they called mediocre had everything that ever mattered, and she'd gotten it the moment she stopped pretending to be small.